Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with a huge week of World War III analysis, a lot to discuss as the Trump presidency continues to move the arc of history along much faster than it was moving, frankly, during the Biden years. So we're going to have to talk about the huge explosion in relations between Zelensky and Trump, Trump calling Zelensky a dictator, Trump negotiating more and more with Putin, Marco Rubio and Lavrov meeting in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, more and more, again, bilateral communications between the Russians and the Americans. The Europeans are feeling boxed out. They're trying to stand by Zelensky, stand by Ukraine, keep the whole project going, but it appears that train is leaving the station, so we're going to get into a full and broad discussion on the future of Ukraine, negotiations, the map, as well as, of course, Frontline updates there. We also need to talk about the situation in the Middle East as Gaza seems about to reignite, as Israel reneges on all of its ceasefire obligations due to this latest hostage kerfuffle. Of course, they're also advancing rapidly in the West Bank due to this foiled, what appears to be false flag bus bombing attack, because the West Bank operation has already been ongoing for 20 plus days. I guess they just needed another pretext to go in even further. But we're also going to be talking about the upcoming German elections. By the time you're listening to this, I think it will be ongoing, if not already decided. So we're going to make our predictions and we'll see how those fare. We're going to be talking about, exercises in the South China Sea, huge advances by the Rwandan-backed M23 militia into Congo as the potential for a third Congo war continues to loom, as well as some major church persecution updates, some situational updates in Myanmar, the Israelis persecuting the Armenian Patriarchate very heavily in Jerusalem, as well as a whole host of other World War III related issues. So very big week. I also want to make sure that everybody checks out our latest Ether Hour episode with Cameron McGregor. It was really good this week. If you want to support the show, of course, and get access to all at this point, nearly 70 Ether Hour episodes, really amazing, uncensored analysis, historical content, orthodox content, geopolitical analysis relating as well to what we talk about on this show. So if you want to support the show and get access to all of that amazing content, you can do that down to the link below at worldwarnow.co. Again, that's our main platform. That's the main way to keep the lights on over here at the World War Now bunker. But with all that being said, be sure to like this episode as well. Your likes and shares are what keep this going and what get this critical information out to the rest of the world. So perhaps some people in positions of power could even hear this analysis, which is what we want to, create a more peaceful world and prevent all of this nonsensical war. But unfortunately, the Third World War lurches on. We've got a lot to discuss this week, again, starting with these negotiations between the Russians and the Americans at the, exclusion of the Ukrainians, which on the one hand does seem positive. There are some externalities that could come into play even in some of the other regions like the Middle East and China. So with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing wonderfully, Conrad, of course, just as wonderful as the peace talks went in Riyadh, the capital of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia this week. And of course, probably the biggest news story, because it's been such a long time since we've seen an entire professional team of, Ushakov, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov himself, these experts on Russian foreign policy travel all the way to a place which many view to be essentially the homeland of Islam in order to speak to some of the top American diplomats led by essentially a Zionist hawk, Marco Rubio, the state secretary himself of the US, led by his own team. And of course, the talks ended fairly amicably. In fact, in conclusion, I think the TLDR of these particular peace talks, or at least their first stages, were that Russia and the US seemingly does want to come to some sort of agreement, with, of course, Ukraine also being in the mix. Frankly, there was no one from Ukraine actually invited to this initial peace talk discussion, which was, I think, hilarious. It's almost like the United States, the Trump administration is treating Zelensky and his Kiev administration as thieves and half-wits as this band of children who just aren't ready to speak like the adults at the sovereign table. These are two big powers of world affairs, right? The two members of the Security Council of the UN. And by the way, the Security Council, if you recall, it entirely agreed in 2014 and 15 to the Minsk Accords, right, which were essentially broken by Ukraine in the first place multiple times, which led to the SMO in the first place. So I think Donald Trump was given a very strong briefing on Ukraine and essentially Ukrainian aggression, which is why in recent press conferences, sort of just after this Riyadh discussion, he openly accused Zelensky of being not just a dictator, but essentially, it was a bit of a hyperbolic statement, I think, by Trump, but he also stated that Ukraine was the actor that initiated the war in the first place, which I think is almost a conspiratorial statement in today's climate. And given that this weekend, in fact, will be the 3rd year anniversary of the special military operation, it's a very bold claim. In fact, Russia early in 2022 was already stating that Ukraine was preparing for some sort of land invasion of the Donetsk Oblast just before the SMO commenced. So in fact, Russia's intervention into the SMO and the special military operation in and of itself was in fact a premeditation strike against the Ukrainian aggressors. And that's essentially what Russia has claimed several times through official channels, and they've presented sort of evidence of that. Ukrainian troops were gathering at the borders, etc., and there was increased artillery bombardment of Donetsk and other places in the oblast, which was quite curious. But back to the Riyadh talks, essentially both sides have agreed that potentially some sort of peacekeepers on the future border between Russia and Ukraine in this sort of buffer zone would be preferable, except Lavrov has made a very clear statement that he wouldn't want any NATO peacekeepers to be involved. And of course, China has already spoken up and said that they're welcoming their own troops to be peacekeepers in this particular scenario if there was, say, a sort of buffer zone or a demilitarized zone such as the one that exists between North and South Korea. If that was ever formulated, China's willing to, of course, dedicate thousands of troops to this particular cause. And I think Turkey would also offer, if not for Lavrov's statement that no NATO country can be involved in these talks, I think that's a very sensible statement by Lavrov. And of course, the interesting thing is that, Conrad, at these particular talks, there was no clear statement about the territories which would be granted to the Russian Federation or Ukraine proper in any sort of form. There was no discussion of would Kherson go to Russia, for example, because they held a referendum? Would Zaporozhye go to Ukraine because, well, Zaporozhye never really had a referendum in the city. There was no real votes. We saw Vladimir Saldo openly stated that every single city in Ukraine, including Odessa, Nikolaev, even Kiev itself, should hold democratic referendums and decide for themselves if there were peace talks to decide if they would want to join the Russian Federation. And in fact, the entirety of Ukraine should hold these sort of democratic elections, which again, it's a bit skeptical if we believe in sort of democratic origins of power and that the people really should decide whether or not they should remain of Russia and Ukraine. We understand that the media does affect the votes of people, but nevertheless, it seems like a more peaceful solution to what's taking place at the moment. But at the end of the day, these initial peace talks, Conrad, they are somewhat ephemeral in that both sides essentially have stated the importance of essentially an organized short-term ceasefire, but no one really signed any documents. It really was a preliminary sort of discussion, at least, but both sides have sat on the same table. And Zelensky and Trump, besides all of this, have been throwing insults across the sea, across the Atlantic at one another, accusing each other of being incompetent. Zelensky essentially openly stating that Trump is surrounded by misinformation agents, blaming Trump for essentially hiring the wrong people into his fresh administration. I mean, that's what he's essentially claiming. And you have people like Elon Musk, of course, now is really deeply involved in the Trump administration, openly saying that Zelensky has murdered Gonzalo Lira through his SBU, through the interrogation and torture that Gonzalo Lira, this American journalist who traveled to Ukraine early in the SMO period, even prior to that, to investigate what was happening in the war. So a lot of, shall we say, monkeys throwing bananas and all kinds of objects at one another. But at the end of the day, it really does seem like a war of ego in the diplomatic sphere. And only Russia is trying to keep its head very cool. Lavrov not really making any concessions, and Vladimir Putin essentially trying to be amicable. He openly said that the peace talks, in his eyes, went quite well. So we know Putin is quite happy with these discussions, and he's happy that the Russian side has not really made any concessions towards the United States and Ukraine. And while this is going on, of course, Russia is advancing on almost every single front, in particular in the Kursk Oblast, which I'm sure we'll discuss in a little bit. So Russia's making gains while the entire world looks at Zelensky and his reputation seems to be tumbling over the edge.
No, that's exactly what seems to be happening. The words that Trump had for Zelensky, I mean, even me, somebody who, Dimitri and I have been covering this for years. We are no fans of Zelensky. At this point, Dimitri, I'm not even, like, in my mind, Zelensky doesn't even exist. Like, he's more of this, like, ephemeral kind of meme character that just kind of represents this analogous specter of the continuing meat grinder, genocidal Jewish war that is going on in Ukraine. But nonetheless, he appears to be a real entity. And, Trump just coming out and saying what we've all been thinking for so long, frankly, about this guy is a bit surprising. Like, I'm almost wondering if he's throwing too many of his cards on the table in this regard and not playing Zelensky properly here. But just to make sure everybody's aware of what was said, this is from CNN after Zelensky told reporters outside his office that Trump is living in a Russian disinformation space. The president then told his aides he wanted to respond directly, CNN reports. So he decided to fire off a Truth Social post calling the elected official a dictator on his way to his golf club in Miami, according to the outlet. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left, Trump wrote Wednesday morning. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something I'll admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. Zelensky was legitimately blah, blah, blah. The article goes on to say a bunch of pro-Zelensky propaganda. But then, of course, today, as we're recording this on Friday, Trump went on to say that he has had good talks with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, but not with Ukraine, as the U.S. pushes negotiations to end the 3-year conflict that began with Putin invading its sovereign neighbor. The comments made at a gathering of Republican and Democrat governors at the White House comes as Trump ramps up criticism of Ukrainian President Zelensky. I've had very good talks with Putin, Trump said, and I've had not so good talks with Ukraine. They don't have any cards, but they play it tough, Trump said of Ukraine. We're not going to let this continue. The war is terrible. It wouldn't have ever happened if I were president, but it did happen. So, of course, Trump, saying his normal campaign-related things, but it does appear that Zelensky is either not going to be the person that ultimately does the negotiating for Ukraine, or he is going to be the one that oversees the total destruction of Ukraine. Because one of the other major comments that Trump made was that Putin knows that he can take the entirety of Ukraine without negotiations. And of course, people are accusing J.D. Vance of somehow giving up Ukraine's strategic advantage by saying that they don't have the capabilities to even resist the Russian advance, let alone take back any of the territory. And J.D. Vance replied on Twitter like, yes, I'm sure the Ukrainians and the Russians needed me to tell, or rather the Russians needed me to tell them that the Ukrainians were, were failing across the front lines, which of course is obviously true. But Dimitri, I'd love to get your thoughts on the full Frontline update. Obviously, Kursk is the main hub that I think Russia is very much trying to actually completely have wrapped up by the time any serious negotiations are underway. If anything, I'm surprised that Lavrov met with Rubio while that was still ongoing. Of course, perhaps we're going to see more confirmations on the North Korean troop situation, but we're also hearing of advances in Sumy and Kharkov, as it appears that Russia is at least trying to get its fingers deeper into those pieces of the pie, again, before any real negotiations start. Because, again, based on Trump's comment about Putin being able to take the whole country, I think it's becoming more and more obvious that the Russians are going to get more territory than a lot of people have expected. I think at least, of course, the rest of Kherson, Zaporozhye Oblast, and I think Sumy, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, and some of these other places, Nikolaev, Odessa, might come into play in some capacity, if not get fully annexed by the Russian Federation. But again, there have been some rumors and some speculation as to, what Russia might be giving up when it comes to these negotiations. And I think for people like us, especially people that are in the West and in America that are trying to, rid themselves of the Zionist occupation, of the, the grip that world Jewry has on Western civilization right now, the fear is that Russia will, sort of get a lot more things that it wants, that America and Trump, who, again, Trump obviously has been accused of being pro-Russian, but I think, again, with all these business opportunities that are going to arise, there is a lot of pressure to completely normalize things with Russia, especially on the energy front. I wanted to quickly read this from oilprice.com. It says Russia dangles Arctic oil to lure back U.S. firms. The Kremlin is signaling that it's once again open for business with American oil companies. If the political wind shift, Russian direct investment fund chief Kirill Dmitriev told reporters ahead of talks in Saudi Arabia that Moscow sees a return of U.S. firms as inevitable, arguing that American majors once thrived in Russia and it would be unwise to ignore the opportunity again. The pitch comes as Russia faces mounting pressure to fill the void left by Western oil field services giants like Halliburton and Baker Hughes, which exited after sanctions took hold. While President Putin has ordered the development of domestic drilling and exploration technologies, Russian experts admit the country remains critically dependent on Western equipment. Hydraulic fracturing technology, vital for boosting well output, is still sourced from unfriendly countries, with key components like rotary steerable systems being 100% imported. Dmitriev emphasized that joint U.S.-Russia projects, particularly in the Arctic, would be mutually beneficial. For now, ExxonMobil remains the only major U.S. oil firm tied to Russian assets, albeit under strained circumstances. The company was forced to abandon its stake in the Sakhalin-1 project after sanctions hit, yet Moscow has twice extended the deadline for the sale, now pushing it to 2026. While the Kremlin is offering access to vast natural resources, Western firms will be weighing the risks. Russia's reliance on foreign technology and ongoing economic isolation make re-entry anything but simple, even with a warm invitation. So I think the prospects here, we know Trump is a businessman. He's going to want to cut a deal. And we know the Russian economy is slowly starting to suffer a bit more from some of these sanctions. But Trump has also openly talked about lowering some of the sanctions. So it appears on the economic front, Russia has, we can almost definitively say, survived, which is very impressive in and of itself. I think even the biggest haters would have to admit that, which we know that they never would. But the political consequences of something like this remain. And the question becomes, will Russia get pressured into perhaps abandoning some of its allies that are also known enemies of the United States, Zionism, and just, global American empire, Zog, hegemony, specifically Iran and China? The question is, Lukashenko specifically talked about the situation with China, he said, we don't know what the U.S. wants. We don't know what they will demand from the Russians to stop the war and so on. It seems to me that they will try to pit the Russians against the Chinese. The Russians cannot allow this. And, this is a good point. I think the same situation arises for the Iranians. While the Russians did sign that very comprehensive agreement with Iran, which may make, severing the country's two ties more difficult. Again, we'll talk about it in a second when it comes to Russo-Turkish relations, but we just can't overlook the idea that when the war that comes between Russia and Turkey in the Middle East arises, it could arise due to Turkey being kicked out of NATO and Russia very rapidly normalizing relations with a Trump-backed, a Trump White House United States. And next thing you know, we've got a war against Turkey and Iran with Russia and the US on the same side, perhaps even against China, because we know a lot of prophecies talk about the Chinese sending hundreds of millions of troops into the Levant, the Russians, of course, descending down to Mount Tabor and fighting the Turks, and that's where they would stop. And again, think somehow Turkey and Iran come together. I know it seems unlikely, and I don't think this scenario is likely. I think it is more likely that Russia and Iran would be on the same side against Turkey. But again, we even heard that Iran was, having pro-Iranian forces trained in northern Cyprus, which of course wouldn't occur without Turkish knowledge. So there are a lot of moving parts here. And again, like Lukashenko said, the potential for turning Russia against China is high. We know Elbridge Colby and many of the other people that people call more reasonable voices that are up and coming in the State Department and the DOD. They are much softer on Russia. They aren't, these genocidal Pale of Settlement Jews that have this ethnic grudge against the Russians, like Victoria Nuland and many others, but rather they are China hawks. And smart China hawks realize that it would be much better to, use our potential Christian white ally of Russia against the real economic challenge to U.S. hegemony, which is China. And of course, the other side of this comes with the fact that everybody involved in this is totally Jewed up and totally pro-Zionist. They had to be to get to where they are within Washington, D.C. And of course, again, while Russia has built this strong relationship with Iran, Russia also always has this permanent relationship with Israel because the Soviet Union, of course, helped found Israel, and the vast majority of the initial Jews that traveled to the Levant to establish the Zionist state were from Russia, the former Pale of Settlement, these places. So I think that is one of the most important questions we have to think about as we go into these negotiations. If it starts to seem that Russia is getting more and more than what we even thought they would as far as territory, as far as sanctions relief, as far as relations with the United States, as well as, the pressure the U.S. is now putting on Europe, who are the ones that are obviously still, waving the bloody shirt, trying to get us to go against Russia. The whole Baltic, Poland situation there is obviously Poland is always weaponizing its border, even potentially against Belarus. But if you want to give us some frontline updates, and then you can comment on the rest of that analysis I just gave, Dimitri, I think we're getting really into some deep, interesting times right now as far as the future of the map and negotiations go.
Yeah, absolutely. Just so everybody understands, the fighting on the front lines, yes, in fact, it has reduced. There are less skirmishes, less sort of engagements across the entire front line. But at the same time, the fighting still goes on, in particular in the Kursk Oblast, which I think the Russians are speedily trying to take it. In fact, there's been a very effective push just around Nikolaev-Adarino, which the Russians captured months ago in the Kursk Oblast, and they're essentially trying to break into the Sumsk Oblast. In fact, there are reports by Russia that the Russians are trying to get into the Sumsk Oblast, which is just on the Ukrainian side, just opposite of the Kursk Oblast, and wrap around from the northwestern side, take the main highway leading to Sudzha and cut off any Ukrainian reinforcements, essentially making a complete surround of the Ukrainian holdings in their stronghold that they've essentially established over the last few hundred days in the main Kursk city of Sudzha. So that would be essentially an effective strategy if the Russians, of course, succeed with it. Tactically speaking, it's a great move. It seems like the Ukrainians were not prepared to defend that northwestern approach, and the Russians have gained several kilometers this week, which I think is quite substantial. Besides that, there haven't really been any major moves inside of the Kursk Oblast besides perhaps the most fiercest battle that we've seen from the Russians, and the Ukrainians have definitely tried to use some footage from this battle in terms of their propaganda. So essentially the Russian 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, so this is a brigade of Russian Marines, which are essentially associated with the Russian Navy, drove tens, probably up to 50 tanks, some of them in a straight line down the main highways, of course, in defensive positioning with good distancing, but still Russia attacked with several tanks towards the village of Nikolskaya. And from the reports, there were two Ukrainian very highly defensive positions in Nikolskaya, this village in the Kursk. And the Russians drove these tanks. The tanks were actually flying Soviet flags of the USSR. I'm not sure where they obtained them from, museums or something, but they were flying red flags. And the symbolism here is, of course, the famous battle between the USSR and the Third Reich in Kurskaya Duga, the greatest tank battle in world history at this point. Thousands of tanks on both sides. It was absolutely incredible during the Second World War. One of the largest battles in world history took place just in this particular region. So the Russians were flying these USSR red flags, and they were met with steep resistance. Hundreds, probably tens, hundreds of Ukrainian drones smashing into the tanks, trying to stop the Russians from approaching Nikolskoye village. And much to the Russians' bravery and courage, essentially this front sort of attack succeeded, and they actually took out both of the Ukrainian defensive positions. According to the Russian sources, just 10 infantrymen were killed in this particular approach. The Ukrainians claim over 100 Russians as well as 12 plus tanks were destroyed. There's really savage footage of some of the tanks were actually driven onto minefields. So they were, of course, as they stood there stationary, their sort of wheels and the guseniцы were blown up by the mines. The Ukrainians would smash drones into the survivors. So there was quite some savage footage of that particular battle and that assault by the Russians. But nevertheless, the Russians succeeded. And Vladimir Putin, just one day after this week, he, of course, signed a decree calling the 155th Brigade, giving it the nickname Kursk. So this is now the Kursk Naval Brigade. In terms of bravery, they were acknowledged by the president himself. This was probably one of the foremost powerful Russian assaults we've seen in the Kursk Oblast thus far. And the Ukrainians, again, claiming that the Russians took heavy losses here, and the Russians symbolically, of course, capturing this particular village with its 2 Ukrainian defensive strongholds. Again, not a symbolic victory, but I think one which will carry forth. Perhaps we'll see assaults and pushes of this sort across the entire war. It's been a while since the Russians have sort of spearheaded a strike such as this. And in ancient times, you would see cavalry of knights probably charging in this particular fashion. But here in the modern times, we, of course, see powerful Russian tanks driving forward. Unfortunately, flying Soviet communist flags, but, there's still some of that baggage left over. And, of course, the symbolism of Kursk itself hands itself over to some of the symbols that the Russians were using. So, nevertheless, one of the most substantial battles this week. But generally speaking, just in the entire week, the Russians have counted that they've shot down across the entire front line 790 Ukrainian drones. And actually, this is the most impressive thing, that they shot down 2 Ukrainian MiG-29 jet fighters. So these are Ukrainian fighter planes, which Ukraine has had even before the SMO commenced. So these are not planes which were handed over by the West. These are not the F-16s. And some of the other news, of course, is that speaking about the Air Force, and Ukraine has been receiving F-16s, Belgium has actually refused to hand over 30 F-16 fighter planes to Ukraine because for some reason the US has delayed shipping the newer model F-35s to Belgium. And it's surprising that Belgium is willing to essentially give up almost half of its Air Force, right, potential to a country which is so corrupt that, now there's this big discussion about Ukrainian military aid. Where exactly has it been going? There's a huge sort of gray area in terms of funding. Money just keeps disappearing. Equipment keeps getting thrown, like in the summer of 2023, into Russian minefields. Again, huge negligence on the Ukrainian end, especially from their commanders and the leadership, the political leadership in Kiev. Very reckless sort of strategies and tactics being used. But nevertheless, the Russians have shot down 2 Ukrainian jets, and every fighter plane from the Ukrainian side, of course, is worth its weight in gold. I think at this point we can definitely conclude that it really drops Ukrainian morale when this particular situation sort of develops going forward. But the interesting thing is that, unfortunately, Ukraine has continued to drone strike civilians. There's been reports of at least 1 civilian who died this week in the Kursk Oblast. He was just driving his sedan. This is a territory which was kilometers away from the front line, Conrad, and the Ukrainians smashed a suicide drone right into the sedan, blowing the person up just on the road. Completely zero. And, the footage is quite gnarly, but there's zero indication that there was any association of the military whatsoever. So civilians in the Kursk Oblast on the Russian side are in permanent danger of these drones essentially flying over into essentially areas which are not really war-related by any stretch, next to the city of Kursk itself, and, of course, exploding, blowing themselves up. The Ukrainians continue to bombard the eastern side of the Kherson region of Russia, continuing to shoot villages and shooting artillery. In the Donetsk Oblast, they've actually shot the, of course, long-suffering town of Gorlovka again. So Ukrainian artillery continues to shoot these long-range missiles at Donetsk cities, which again prompts Russia to continue pushing. And in fact, it is. And we see Russia progressing just west of Toretsk, which it captured 2 weeks ago. So Russians are actually pushing towards the city of Slavyansk, again, trying to take back some of that territory, which it used to have, of course, before the Minsk agreements, and it used to have at the beginning of essentially the entire Ukrainian civil war. This is just territory which Russia essentially is regaining. Most of these territories, by the way, are entirely pro-Russian, so we just have to sort of give that conclusion. There has been some progress in Volchansk, on the outskirts of the city of Volchansk. This is Kharkovskaya Oblast, as you said, very important because this is an area, again, deeply populated by Russian speakers. If you would probably give the vote to the people in the Kharkov, in the city itself and on the outskirts, they would probably vote in order to join the Russian Federation. Kharkov was always considered a very deeply Russian city, and the Russians are fighting near the Volchya Reka, which I guess translates to the Wolf River, on the outskirts of Volchansk, trying to make us around. Again, Volchansk has a direct highway, newly built, by the way, which leads to the city of Kharkov itself, which again will reinforce the taking of that city, hopefully in the future. But the Russians definitely making progress on almost every single front. And that really does show because the Ukrainians, again, are very desperate for Western aid. It seems like most of their attention now is directed towards accusing the US of not providing enough whilst not making any sort of gains on any sort of front line here. Of course, the main city we're watching at the moment is Pokrovsk, which at the moment is experiencing the most intense fighting, especially in the southwestern region, as the Russians are trying to surround it by going from the east and from the west. In the west, in particular, the Ukrainians are throwing everything into the meat grinder. Hopefully, at the moment, the meat grinder is staying outside of the city itself. It's on the outskirts, but the fighting is still very intense. In fact, there's a lot of Ukrainian journalists are joking that, well, if we say anything anti-Zelensky, we're going to be sent to Pokrovsk. It's like, it's equivalent to Third Reich Germans joking that he'll be sent to the Eastern Front, right, out of like cozy France or Belgium or something of that sort. It's that savage in Pokrovsk at the moment that the death rate is probably quite high, I think, unfortunately, from the Ukrainian side. And Arestovich has openly said that if Pokrovsk falls, he believes the entire Zelensky regime won't be able to handle that loss. It's similar to Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Toretsk. This will just be a huge blow to Ukrainian morale. So quite interesting how all of the Ukrainian oppositionary politicians, including Arestovich and others, are essentially watching Zelensky very carefully, seeing how much land can he lose before, of course, internally he's perhaps deposed or there is some sort of coup happening in Kiev. But at the moment, Zelensky is sort of holding his own, or at least representing the particular groups which are standing behind him. Because at the end of the day, he is an actor. He is sort of an entity which is a personification of a certain regime, right? He's the front man. He's like the PFP image of a particular group of oligarchs or power centers who are probably funding and probably have had him elected in the first place. But on the internal political front, Conrad, we do see Poroshenko being threatened with internal sanctions by the Ukrainian regime. We know that Poroshenko's main trial is coming up in March of this year, so just in a month's time. And most likely his party, European Solidarity, has lost a lot of seats in the Ukrainian parliament, but Poroshenko himself, being this Ukrainian Jewish oligarch, still holds a lot of influence in Ukrainian circles. So I wonder if we'll see some sort of revolt within the Ukrainian political system, just as these peace talks are going very badly, just as the sanction lifting against Russia is being brought to the table. The Russians really want the sanctions lifted, as you said. It's one of the main conditions, I think, of the coming and developing peace talks. But I think Ukraine is suffering quite greatly, both on the diplomatic and, of course, on the military side of things. And I think this is a good thing because this will give the Russians more leverage, perhaps to put other considerations on the table, such as church persecution, perhaps have the Ukrainian regime relax a bit and sort of stop some of its satanic policies that it's been pushing over the last few years.
Good old Voltsman, Poroshenko, we always love to hear what he's up to. But quickly, before I move on to some of these other issues, use Turkey and Syria as a bit of a bridge between Russia, Ukraine, and then the rest of our discussion on what's going on in the Levant and Palestine. What do you think is going to happen as far as the power struggle in Ukraine? Are there going to be elections? Is the U.S. going to be able to pressure Zelensky to agree to that? And if so, who is going to run? Are we going to get Zaluzhny returning from his, exile as the ambassador to the UK in London? Is Sirski going to try to do something? I mean, are we even going to get to elections? Will there be a military struggle that gets Zelensky out of there? Will Zelensky himself be forced to flee? Will the Russians make the U.S. pressure the Ukrainians is to bring back Medvedchuk or somebody like this? I mean, are they going to get a more pro-Russian person in there? Is somebody like Arestovich, a sleeper agent? Is he going to finagle for power and then come out and be like, oh, I'm super pro-Russian as a sort of self-serving play? I think there's a lot of questions there.
Absolutely. I think the Russians, I've heard, for example, Yegor Holmogorov on the Sputnik patriotic sort of radio news channel, he openly stated that Zaluzhny could in fact be even a more dangerous version of Zelensky because he's a sort of supreme commander of Ukraine who actually achieved certain victories, right, in 2022 as the Russians pushed back out of Kherson, Izum, etc., and out of the Kharkovsky Oblast. So Zaluzhny has a reputation of success behind him. And if he returns out of his unfortunate sort of not self-imposed, but Zelensky-imposed exile, because remember the triumvirate of Arestovich, Zaluzhny, Zelensky were essentially the free, and of course Reznikov as well, the defense minister, who's now being replaced by a man who essentially looks like a Talmudic merchant himself, claims to be of Tatar Crimean origin. But this triumvirate is, two of them are essentially in self-imposed exile. Arestovich is traveling around Europe and America. Zaluzhny is in the UK as the technical ambassador in London. So I think if Zaluzhny does return and he runs against Zelensky, his particular platform, especially if somebody like Poroshenko stands behind him, I think it'll be a sure victory against Zelensky, because Zelensky's main, as I've stated this multiple times, Zelensky's main achievement in this entire debacle is the fact that he could secure an insane amount of funding for Ukraine, right? Which nobody else really could organize. And probably this is because of his, again, that some of that Jewish background that he has, sort of guaranteed funding from essentially Zog-occupied European countries, NATO nations, the EU, and of course America in and of itself, and perhaps his sort of friendly ties with countries such as somehow there is this friendly connection between Zelensky and Erdogan, which we'll discuss a bit later, but also Israel as well. So I think Zelensky still has certain aces in his pocket, but that recent proposition, right, of handing over Ukrainian minerals to the United States in order to repay the military aid that was provided to Ukraine, essentially strings attached. Notice that this means that all that aid that was provided to Ukraine had essentially an expiration date. It had a repayment model attached to it. And those minerals, that plan was proposed initially by Zelensky weeks ago. It's just nobody really spoke about it back then because we thought, well, it's just Zelensky's stupid rhetoric. He says crazy things almost every month, doesn't really make constructive statements, but it's been taken on board by the Trump administration. Now Trump is sort of hammering the idea that Ukraine needs to hand over its minerals. The only concerning part about this entire debacle, Conrad, is the fact that these minerals, again, most of them belong to Russian-held territories in the east, and of course central Ukraine around Dnipro. These places have some of these old Zoltye Vody uranium mines, etc. So it's a central eastern Ukrainian territories in which the war is actually taking place. These areas are not very safe. And again, if Lavrov says no NATO peacekeepers, who exactly is going to keep all of the American miners safe as they extract these minerals? And of course, where are they going to ship them to the US? What they're going to take them to the train stations and they're going over the Dnieper, or they're going to take them to cities like Odessa and Nikolaev. And again, it's very unsafe territories, unsafe waters. And in order for this project to even work out in the first place, there needs to be a long-standing sort of peace signed by both Russia, the US, and Ukraine, which at the moment is very much still in the works. The other consideration is that Zelensky's opponents, Conrad, you very correctly put it, that they will blame Zelensky for selling their country out. They're going to say that, well, this funny Jewish clown character, this actor, has essentially put us into debt, which we will never be able to repay, and we're going to be handing over our national inheritance to overseas lords who really don't care about us. And look, they don't care about us because they've stopped supporting us. They've stopped sending us Abrams tanks. Belgium is not giving us F-16s anymore. These Scandinavian countries have refused to give any more fighter planes, etc. So they're going to force the blame onto Zelensky in a short-term rhetorical victory. And this may, of course, force him out of power. Again, there's claims that Zelensky should be moving to France. I think New York Post actually said that Zelensky, or it was a Washington Post, one of these Western journal articles essentially stated that Zelensky should be seeking refuge abroad in order to, of course, protect himself. And we have to keep in mind, Ukraine still has very strong, and like the denazification angle really hasn't been covered on a lot of these geopolitical shows, Conrad, but Ukraine still has very much, and I would say exaggerated to the point of they have growing organizations which are very, very right-wing, very Bandera in nature. And as soon as Zelensky begins selling off their national land, they're sort of that which belongs to their blood, I think you'll have another actor coming to the force. And this is people like Artyom Dmitruk, who's at the moment is in the UK, in London, but he's openly stated that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine should unite around orthodoxy. And this guy was a radical, almost like a right sector Azov battalion type of guy. Is a former Ukrainian wrestler. He looks like visually speaking, he appears to be of like a Viking, sort of Slavic, Varyag physiognomy. And he's openly stated that Russia should unite through its right-wing Christian values of Belarus and Ukraine, and they should, of course, depose some of these people holding control in Kiev. So you have even Ukrainian nationalists who are fervently pro-Ukrainian at the beginning of the SMO. Now, some of these politicians who Zelensky sent out into exile are now counter-signaling him very openly. So there is that, I think, the shadow factor of the right wing in Ukraine also rising up and perhaps overthrowing the current regime. And I think that may be the most positive aspect, not because they're Banderites, but I think, generally speaking, their adherence to right-wing conservative values may in fact play this sort of surprising card. And in fact, this may guarantee the capturing of power, the recapturing of it by figures such as Kolomoisky, Weizmann, and some of these other very shadowy oligarchs. We don't really want them to come to power again in Ukraine. And Zaluzhny himself is a very Kabbalistic, rabbi-aligned sort of politician and commander himself. So in some way, perhaps it will benefit both Russia and Belarus if a more right-wing Ukrainian, maybe amicable regime comes to power. So I guess we'll just have to see how things develop and how Zelensky's continued failures, both on the front lines for his commander Syrskyi, who really hasn't proven himself, and his diplomatic failures continue to expand. Because again, I think his regime is very much on the line now that he's being openly attacked by figures such as Elon Musk, Donald J. Trump, J.D. Vance, etc.
Yeah, I mean, we're hearing that Elon is supposedly going to turn off the Starlink that the Ukrainians have access to, which again, that's the only way they're able to do these strikes on Crimea, do these strikes on all the other, deeper Russian cities that are farther behind the front line at this point. So if that goes, then again, they're going to be in even more trouble. So the link between, Trump's, control of the American apparatus, as well as Elon Musk's multi-pronged, multi-industrial empire is really factoring into the US's leverage here. The US, having a lot more leverage ultimately than the EU. The UK, of course, Keir Starmer being the one to float the idea of putting UK peacekeepers there, which has now been completely rejected by the US and the Russians. So he just got totally cucked after trying to kind of do a power play. And again, I think we're all still surprised by how much Macron has committed himself to the Ukraine project. We always thought the French would be a bit more reasonable, but I mean, especially considering the generals and the other leaders that they had that understood the Russia situation, that understood what was really going on over in that part of the world. But those people have all been purged. And like now you've said, it seems that Zelensky is more likely to have to go to France to flee. And it seems that Macron is making statements like, we will pick up the burden, we will allow Ukraine to defend itself. And then you have former Finnish PM Sanna Marin and these other people saying that Europe needs to be strong again. Europe needs to stop believing that it's weak. And so all of this, of course, factoring into Trump's plans to make everybody pay their fair share of NATO. We may be seeing a somewhat remilitarization of Europe going on. But again, some of that may face a bit of a different challenge as the entirety of Eastern and Central Europe finally warms up to Russia. We're going to talk about the upcoming German elections later on in the show. But you mentioned earlier the church persecutions being potentially a vector for negotiations and something that the Russians can ask for. And we're going to talk about some more details of persecutions in the future. But I just want to be on the record as saying that I do not support religious freedom for the OCU, for example. Obviously, Ukraine right now is trying to be this Western liberal democracy. They want to be in NATO. They want to be in the EU. So yes, we're going to try to hold them to that same standard when they persecute the UOC, because they want to be a liberal democracy, then they have to let, even if a church is quote unquote connected to the Russians, which obviously it really isn't, we have to explain that that must still be allowed. However, when Russia takes over and the historical true protector of this land comes back, which is the Russian Empire, then I do not support the OCU existing because the OCU is a threat to canonical orthodoxy. The OCU are, I believe, complicit in effectively genocide, which we're going to read more about what they've been up to and the evil things that they're doing, stealing more churches, trying to kill more people. Of course, Robert Amsterdam, the main attorney for the UOC, was on Tucker Carlson this week. We're going to talk about that in a second as well. But I just want to say that I fully support arresting some of these characters like Serge Dumenko, supposed Metropolitan Epiphany, as well as anybody else, of course, that participated in the persecution of the UOC. I believe that that organization should be banned. And I believe that obviously the Tomos of autocephaly that was given to them by the EP should be ripped up. And the UOC should be the only Orthodox church that is able to act in Ukraine. I want to come on the record as saying that. And I think we'll discuss that a little bit more later. But when it comes to Ukraine's allies and, potential negotiating places. You mentioned, of course, Zelensky's interesting relation with Erdogan and Turkey. This is from Middle East Eye here. It says Russia's Lavrov plans to visit Turkey amid Ukraine talks. This is from Rajib Soylu, who is pretty much the biggest journalist in Turkey. It says Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov plans to visit Turkey next week as part of his regional tour. Sources familiar with the matter told Middle East Eye. Lavrov is expected to be in Ankara on the 24th and 25th of February, according to one of these sources. Earlier this week, Lavrov informed the Russian Duma, the lower house of Russia's parliament, that there would be high-level talks with the Syrian government next week, which could indicate a visit by the Russian foreign minister to Syria as well. The timing of Lavrov's visit to Turkey coincides with the recent launch of talks between the U.S. and Russia on the Ukraine war. Lavrov's agenda isn't immediately clear, as he was also scheduled to meet his Turkish counterpart on Thursday in Johannesburg on the sidelines of the G20 foreign ministers meeting. In a major policy shift, the Trump administration has sidelined Ukraine and the EU from negotiations, saying that Ukraine's NATO membership bid is unrealistic and that no U.S. troops should be deployed in the Eastern European country as part of future security guarantees. On Wednesday, U.S. President Donald Trump told journalists that Russia had fought for certain territories in Ukraine and suggested that Moscow might retain some of them. He later referred to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator without elections. Turkey, on the other hand, reaffirmed its full support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence during Zelensky's visit to Ankara on Tuesday. Zelensky said that President Erdogan continues to support Kiev's NATO bid. A source familiar with the discussions clarified that Ankara was not attempting to make a political statement by hosting Zelensky amid the current tensions between Washington and Kiev. The visit had been planned well in advance of recent developments. Zelensky was originally scheduled to travel to Riyadh from Turkey as part of a regional tour, with Ankara serving as a convenient stopover and an important ally to consult with. However, he canceled a trip to Saudi Arabia after being caught off guard by high-level talks between American and Russian officials, which excluded Ukraine. Since 2022, Turkey has played a key role as a facilitator in negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. However, this role has become less significant now that Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are engaging in direct diplomatic discussions. This week, Moscow announced that Russia and the U.S. would restore diplomatic relations. A second source noted that it is somewhat ironic that Ukraine now seeks inclusion in talks with Russia, as Turkey repeatedly advocated for all sides to come to the negotiating table to discuss a ceasefire and a potential peace deal. Turkish officials have long warned that the war would be prolonged and that Russia would not be easily defeated. So again, it appears that, as we've said a million times on this show, Turkey does not support Russia, even in like a crypto sense, even in a having to play their cards close to their chest sense. Turkey are NATO members. Erdogan recognizes the huge pro-Western opposition that he has, so he realizes he can't actually explicitly join up with these multipolar powers, and he doesn't want to because he is interested in restoring the Ottoman Empire, and as somebody who understands history, he realizes that Russia cannot become their pair power on the Black Sea, controlling more territory and more coastline than them, and I also can't continue to take over in Syria, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Turks were pressuring the SNA and HTS to not give Russia the deal that they want regarding their air bases in Latakia and elsewhere across Syria. So again, this is very interesting. And again, we've talked about on the show how Turkey has always reiterated that they fully support Ukraine taking back all of its territory, including Crimea, which again factors into, Turkey still talks about the non-existent Tatar minority on Crimea and how Ukraine needs to liberate them and how Tatars stand, and basically openly saying that they want to exert their influence across the Black Sea. And again, we know where this is all going to lead. We talk about it a lot on the show, but I think people just need to remember that. And before I get your thoughts, I just want to round this all out with what's going on in Syria. And of course, this is from It's Turkey, Syrian Kurdish SDF trade fire in northern Syria. The announcement earlier this week that the Kurdish SDF has agreed to integrate into the Syrian army does not appear to be impacting the ongoing fighting in the Aleppo governorate, where Turkey and the Turkish-backed SNA continue to try to push into Kurdish-held territory, and both sides are trading fire across the region. Turkish airstrikes were reported in several areas, with the highest intensity being around the city of Kobani. Those strikes hit areas on the outskirts of Kobani, including Kasak village and the Sarin airport. Strikes were also reported near the Karkozak bridge, which SNA fighters have been trying to take. The SDF, for their part, carried out missile strikes against Turkey's Al-Hushariya base in the outskirts of the city of Jarablus. No casualties have been reported from this incident. The SDF also reported that they have shot down 2 Turkish drones near the Tishrin Dam. They reported that the drones were supporting the targeting of villages near the dam, and noted that those villages came under heavy shelling from Turkish and SNA forces the day before. The SNA has been trying to take the Tishrin Dam and the Karakozak Bridge for months. So far, with limited success, the Tishrin Dam is the most important source of fresh water and electricity generation in northeastern Syria. Turkey is believed to want to use control over the dam to force concessions out of the Kurds that live in the area. And of course, Metropolitan Neophytos has talked a lot about, the prophecies about the Euphrates dying up and how, of course, the Turks are the ones that control all the damming of that right now, but how ultimately in the future it will actually be Chinese troops that fully drain the Euphrates with their need for fresh water as they march into the Levant. But this article goes on to say that Kurdish officials noted that the talks on the integration with the Syrian army are still in relatively early stages, and while the SDF agreed to expel foreign fighters from their forces to promote national unity, important details like the fate of massive oil and gas fields presently under Kurdish control have yet to be discussed. So, again, Turkey is continuing its advance in Syria as Israel continues its advance across the southern parts of that region into those Druze areas, well deep into the Quneitra province. And HTS, of course, which has continued to be struck more and more by Israel at this point, Israel growing more wary of their Islamist leanings, they continue to talk to the Russians. And as I read in that article from Middle Eastern Eye earlier, it appears that Lavrov may be traveling to Syria to meet with them, which could indicate that they are close to a deal regarding those bases that Russia is, of course, trying to maintain. But before we move on to talk about the rest of the Levant, Dimitri, I'd love your thoughts on the situation in Syria and how you think Russia and Turkey could clash there and how it even relates to Ukraine.
Yeah, I think the surprising thing was on the night of the 17th of February, or that is early morning 18th February, there was a surprise drone attack actually on the Russian Khmeimim base. This is the huge Russian airport base in the north. So the Tartus port is in the south. And this is in Syria, of course, that an unknown adversary could have been Turkish drones, could have been some drones from, Al-Qaeda, HTS derivatives, who knows exactly. But these particular drones were attacking the Russian Khmeimim Latakia base, and at least 3 of them were shot down. There was a 17-second clip video, which essentially had 3 explosions in the air. So the Russian Pantsir air defense system was actually shooting down certain drones over the Russian base. And I guess it raises concerns. Who is flying military drones in allegedly peaceful, at least the western part of Syria, right? Is the Syrian new occupational regime led by, of course, al-Julani himself that Putin spoke to over the phone last week? Is it guaranteeing the safety of these bases? Or just like you mentioned, Lavrov, does he need to actually secure some sort of agreement? Because you recall, Conrad, one of the statements that the official HTS oppositionary government that has now occupied Damascus, one of the statements that it's made is very clearly that they wish to have Bashar al-Assad extradited alongside with his family to Syria in order to face justice. And I'm not sure what Wahhabi Sharia justice means for the Bashar al-Assad family, but I'm sure it's not something that Russia would like to, of course, see and would like to be accused of promoting, especially since we recall what happened when Yeltsin gave concessions to the Chechen militants in 1996. Of course, the Chechen militants and the various Wahhabis, those who came from the Gulf countries, these extremists began to set up essentially slave markets, Sharia law in Chechnya and Grozny, etc. There was literally a return back to literally 7th century bizarre Gulf state ethics, right, in that particular part of the world. And that was only 1996, right? So as we can imagine, I think Russia wants to keep its head high and sort of wants to continue being this virtuous guardian of its former allies. And in fact, this is why Bashar al-Assad probably has this weird gag order on him. He hasn't really given any statements since his departure and since his stay in Russia. And that is partially concerning, but I think none of us want to really see Bashar al-Assad facing some sort of criminal trial by so-called Sharia judges and justices in the now occupied Syria. But these 2 bases are incredibly important because at the moment, Russia doesn't really have shall we say, like a cemented foothold in Libya at the moment. In any case, Libya is a lot more of a destabilized country than Syria. These Russian bases in Syria have been standing for more than a decade now. So in fact, it's well established. The Russians know the landscape. They know the areas. It's a lot closer to the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Russian reshipments, of course, are very handy. And in the future, if there are any conflicts with Turkey, Russia could, of course, utilize these bases to great advantage. Now, of course, this will be very contingent on exactly what Lavrov speaks to the new HTS government about, but there are real concerns. And we saw last week, Conrad, of course, the weird Syrian sort of patrol posts, right, stopping Russian equipment from going further south out of the Khmeimim base into Tartus in order to be shipped off to the Russian mainland. Again, very concerning and always open, like the possibility of a black swan event happening in that part of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's all very concerning. We are watching it incredibly closely. So Syria is one of these places, Conrad, that I think the news will perhaps drop down in terms of severity. We'll probably continue to hear about Kurdish involvement and their fights against the now newly established Syrian government. But the Russians, I think, will try to minimize their involvement and try to limit themselves to these 2 particular bases and try to hold on to them for as long as possible. And sort of to lead this into, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian discussion further down south and that what is happening in Lebanon, we did see, of course, Beryl Lazar, of course, returning from his wedding that took place in the West Bank occupied city of Ma'ala Adumim, and Beryl Lazar, as well as Rabbi Alexander Baroda meeting with Vladimir Putin inside of the Kremlin halls. Again, disrespectfully, these Chabad Lubavitch rabbis are wearing their black top hats inside, of course, passing through these halls with icons up. Very disrespectful. These halls, and once saints walked amongst them, saintly patriarchs, metropolitans, all kinds of svitители and bishops and monks, and of course the Tsars themselves. And now these Chabad Lubavitch rabbis are walking around the Kremlin, meeting with Putin. And of course, Putin very disrespectfully sort of claiming that Hamas has a goodwill sort of stance towards the exchange of hostages, to which Beryl Lazar really kept a poker face, but I'm sure inside he was not very happy with that particular statement by Putin. So Putin, again, sort of forced to collaborate with the rabbis on some particular level. We're not sure which, but generally speaking, as we said in our ex post, right, Conrad, it's not a norm. These rabbis walking amongst the halls of the Kremlin, this is very much leftover baggage from Bolshevik diplomatic policies between these various religions. And again, it sort of ties to the fact that Russia is still, at least part of Russian culture, is still occupied by these particular shadow players of globalist Talmudic governance of world affairs. So this is tying in the entire Middle East. There's, of course, this shadow specter looming, sort of forcing these various conflicts, both in Syria, in Ukraine. They benefit from these conflicts themselves. Of course, they invest in them, and they're always there willing to take up these various bizarre alliances. Like you said, the relationship between Israel and Russia continues to be strong somehow, despite the fact that Russia has over 10% of its population is Sunni Muslim, and their brothers, in fact, are suffering in Palestine. So a very curious situation. And as it unfolds, I think we'll see hopefully further worsening of Russian-Israeli relations in order to establish some sort of justice. And perhaps Russia can come out as this Christian defender of Christian rights in Palestine. I think that's probably the long-term aspiration that we really have. The Russia needs to protect Christianity in the Holy Land from militant Zionism. And I think this is the essential goal of both the Russian Empire. It was the goal, and it should be the motivation for the Christian Russians to further develop any sort of presence both in Syria and further south in the Holy Land itself.
Yeah, regarding the Christians, of course, Patriarch Theophilos, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, recently showed a film highlighting the persecution and suffering of Palestinian Christians to the UN. It was very good. And of course, a lot of people are, the Israeli forces online are coming after him and coming after Archbishop Atala Hana, who of course is very pro-Palestinian. He's even been excluded from the synod of the Patriarchate due to his outspoken pro-Palestinian stance. People accuse him of being pro-Muslim, but he's from Nablus. He understands the situation that's going on there. And the West Bank right now is becoming the new center of this. We're going to talk about Gaza as well, but people probably heard about the foiled supposed bus bombings that occurred the other night. And this is from antiwar.com. Netanyahu orders West Bank escalation after empty buses explode in Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered a massive escalation in the Israeli-occupied West Bank after 3 empty buses exploded in the Israeli city of Bat Yam near Tel Aviv. The Prime Minister has ordered the IDF to carry out an intensive operation against centers of terrorism in Judea and Samaria, which is what the Jews call the West Bank. Netanyahu's office said in a statement using the biblical name for the West Bank, the buses that exploded were empty and in separate parking lots, and Israeli police said 2 additional unexploded bombs were found. No one was wounded or injured in the blasts. Israeli police say they're treating the incident as a suspected terror attack, and Israeli officials are claiming the blasts are tied to the West Bank, although so far no Palestinian group has taken credit for the bombing. On January 21st, Israel launched a new operation in the West Bank dubbed Iron Wall that had focused on the northern cities of Tulkarm and Jenin and their refugee camps. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed and tens of thousands have been forcibly evacuated from their homes, the most significant displacement in the territory since 1967. The Israeli military has expanded its open fire orders in the West Bank, leading to a surge in the killings of Israeli civilians by IDF troops. Among those killed in the recent operations have included a pregnant woman, a 2-year-old girl, and a 7-year-old boy. Netanyahu's order suggests the Israeli assault on the occupied West Bank will intensify even more. The bus explosions also risk the fragile ceasefire deal in Gaza, as elements of the Israeli government are looking for excuses to restart the genocidal war. And again, people have already supposedly been detained, having set up these bombs, and I think most of them have been reported as Jewish. So I think this is likely just a false flag. Again, no Palestinians took credit for this. This was outside of Tel Aviv. There's no direct evidence that this has anything to do with the West Bank per se, but Netanyahu immediately bounced on the opportunity while the news cycle was still hot and escalated the situation in the West Bank like a good, media-savvy, never let a good crisis go to waste politician understands. Because, Netanyahu, he's traveling all across the fronts to Syria, to the West Bank, which he was just in the West Bank, in Tulkarm, talking about how the operations need to expand and how terrorism in Israel won't stop until they fully occupy Judea and Samaria. But of course, the fact that the situation in Gaza is also unfolding in the same way is just making the situation even worse. And the reports from the Israeli broadcast authorities say that, this is a direct quote, Israel intends to resume fighting despite progress in negotiations. And Trump also said, this is from Channel 14, so we don't have this confirmed, but Israeli news is saying this as if it's true. U.S. President Trump told his consultants in his reaction to seeing the humiliating return of the bodies of Israeli hostages, I want to see Gaza destroyed, and I do not want to see even one existing building. So, of course, the death of these hostages, these young children and this woman, is being sort of paraded all over the Western media as a reason that the ceasefire in Gaza needs to stop, which again, it makes me sick. We've got tens of thousands of children killed by the IDF across Gaza. And now because it was obvious that the Israelis killed these hostages, they were killed in a bombing, had to string this whole narrative about how the babies and the infants and the woman were beaten to death in these horrible ways, and then their bodies afterwards were mangled in a way to make it look like they died in an explosion. Well, have you seen Gaza? What's more likely, this rigmarole, mousetrap type, weird Holocaust narrative, masturbation machine, roller coasters in the oven type thing, or that they just got blown up in a bombing like a bunch of other hostages have because Israel has been using bunker busters across the entire Gaza Strip. That's obviously what happened here, but I'll read the article anyway. Netanyahu adds new demands in talks on second phase of Gaza deal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has added several new demands amid negotiations for the second phase of the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal, Israel's Channel 13 has reported. The report said Netanyahu is demanding Hamas leadership be exiled, for Gaza to be demilitarized, and for Israel to continue maintaining security control of the Strip, which would mean a continued Israeli military occupation or blockade. Hamas has rejected Israeli calls for the group to be disarmed, and its main demand has been for an Israeli withdrawal, meaning it would be unlikely to agree to an arrangement that keeps Israeli troops in Gaza. On Wednesday, Hamas offered to release all remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire and full Israeli withdrawal. Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy for the Middle East, acknowledged on Thursday that it would be difficult for the second phase of the ceasefire to be implemented, but said it was a possibility. The issue with phase 2 is that there's supposed to be an end to the war, and the Israelis have a red line that Hamas cannot be in the government. It's hard to square that circle, but we're making a lot of progress in that conversation, and hopefully it leads to good things and good results. Witkoff also defended Trump's call for the U.S. to take over Gaza, which would require an ethnic cleansing campaign since Palestinians don't want to leave despite the massive destruction caused by the U.S.-backed Israeli siege and bombing campaign. I sat in Gaza with a bulletproof vest looking at the scenery, and I don't know why anyone would want to live there today. It's illogical to me, Witkoff said. The Trump administration has also backed Netanyahu's stated goal of eradicating Hamas, signaling that the U.S. is ready to support Israel if it decides to restart its genocidal war in Gaza. In the meantime, the hostage exchanges continue as Hamas released 4 bodies of Israeli captives, including the remains of Kafir and Ariel Bibas, brothers who were only 9 months and 4 years old when kidnapped during the October 7th attack on southern Israel. Hamas has maintained that the children and their mother were killed by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza in November 2023. Israel said it identified the remains of Kafir and Ariel after receiving their remains, but claimed the third body was not their mother. Hamas is expected to release 6 live Israeli hostages on Saturday, and Israel will free hundreds of Palestinians from Israeli jails, including many women and children who were captured in Gaza following October 7th, despite having nothing to do with the attack. So the situation about the U.S. taking over Gaza is obviously still very weird and up in the air, but Hamas has also openly said that they're open to the Palestinian Authority coming in and starting to restore some rule of law to the Gaza Strip, but I think the Israelis have come out explicitly against that. A huge collection of Muslim countries traveled to Riyadh for an unofficial summit with Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi king, to discuss the future of Gaza. I don't believe the UAE was there because the UAE have gone full Shabbos Goy and have just accepted that they want Gazans to be expelled to Egypt and Jordan. And of course, we know that that has to do with the UAE's huge investment and huge chance to benefit from the IMEC corridor, which would flow from the UAE through Saudi Arabia up through Gaza, of course, originating over in India. But the other main front, of course, we have to discuss is Lebanon, and it appears to be the only thing that the Israelis are somewhat, keeping their word on, and they are withdrawing from southern Lebanon. The 18th is when that had begun. However, they seem to have insisted on keeping a sort of residual force in these 5 villages. I'm not sure if that's actually going through. The U.S. seems to have insisted that they don't do that, but I think in the next few days we'll learn what really happened there. But in the midst of all of this, the Israeli withdrawal or not withdrawal, depending on how those 5 towns end up. This all is leading up to the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah, which we know a lot of people are traveling into Lebanon for. There have been major tensions between the Sunni and Shias there, as well as the Maronites and other Christians. So Lebanon, as usual, a hotbed of sectarian religious conflict. From the Seattle Times, nearly 5 months after he was killed in an Israeli airstrike, thousands of supporters of the longtime leader of Lebanon's militant Hezbollah group have flown into Beirut for Hassan Nasrallah's funeral on Sunday. Nasrallah was killed on September 27th when Israel's Air Force dropped more than 80 bombs on Hezbollah's main operations room in southern Beirut. It was the biggest and most consequential of Israel's targeted killings in years. The death of Nasrallah, one of Iran-backed Shiite group's founders and Hezbollah's leader of more than 30 years, was a huge blow to the group he had transformed into a potent force in the Middle East. So even Jackson Hinkle, everybody's favorite coal-posting Fed, is going to be there. I don't think Hezbollah realizes that's not a good look for them, but Regardless, in the midst of all of this, we're hearing from the Iran-backed Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq that the Syrians have actually chosen them and that they're even indicating that they might move into Syria. And again, we know that there's been clashes on the Syrian-Lebanese border as pro-Hezbollah clans have clashed with HTS, and the Israelis have even used this as an opportunity to bomb those pro-Hezbollah clans as HTS has sort of flushed them out. So the sort of crescent, the Iranian axis of resistance crescent, is very much in flux right now. And again, we heard the rumors that there was supposed to be an Iranian-backed coup to overthrow Shara al-Jalani. And again, this rumor is from the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq that they may be making a move into Syria. We're going to see how that goes. But again, Hezbollah, they have Naim Qassem and their leadership have come out and said that they're willing to start up operations again if the Gaza situation doesn't advance, but it's with much less fervor and much less firm resolve than when Nasrallah was the one making the statements, unfortunately. So the situation there is unfolding very much still in Israel's favor. However, I think we really need to wait and see how Saudi Arabia is able to direct Jordan and Egypt regarding the future of the Gazans. And I think Iran might still have a few cards to play regarding Syria. And of course, the Houthis are still there awaiting to continue their blockade and strikes on the Red Sea if things begin to go the way that the Jews and Netanyahu want them to, particularly in Gaza. So we're praying for that situation for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite hypocritical now that Saudi Arabia, it's been more than a year since the genocide in Gaza actually commenced. Now Saudi Arabia is like, we will be discussing with our Arabic brothers in Egypt and Jordan peaceful solution to the Gaza situation. So now Saudi Arabia comes out as this peacekeeper after, of course, it signals its intention to sort of stop the Houthis, who at the moment are, of course, licking their wounds, sort of reestablishing some of their frontier formations. Again, all at risk that this peace in Gaza, Conrad, as soon as that reignites, unfortunately, I think the Houthis will be involved again and the Red Sea crisis will again recommence, because that's always, I think, on the table. The Houthis have openly spoken out about supporting the Gazan Palestinians no matter what. They're pretty much the only group, even more so than Iran itself, to openly state that they're willing to fight day and night in order to free the Palestinians from the repression and the genocide which the Israelis forced upon them. And, the hypocrisy sort of traverses ethnic boundaries, you can almost say, because I would say Netanyahu, the display given by him, as well as supported by Western media sources, all kinds of Zog-occupied media, including Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, naturally, and even evangelical pastors across the US. We've seen them, like Greg Locke, for example. He's disgusting he's visiting the red heifers in Jerusalem, for example.
Yeah, that guy's not a Christian. I'm sorry. Like, that's just that guy.
Yeah, he's wearing a Star of David medallion as he visits the red heifers. This was in February, just this week, and he gives a display and says, this is for the reestablishment of Jerusalem, for Christ our Lord to return. And it's like, I don't think he's waiting for Christ. I think he's waiting for the third temple to be rebuilt and for the Antichrist to fool him. I mean, that's the entire point of this false Moshiach, to arrive and, of course, present himself as the second coming. I mean, a lot of Christians, especially those with the Protestant denominations, will fall for this great subversion during the end times. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing sort of preludes to that now. But Netanyahu, notice the hypocrisy on it, absolutely insane. The concerns he has over the bodies of the hostages, which you correctly said were handed over by Hamas, perhaps with certain optical issues, right? Again, the Palestinians singing songs and celebrating they're not celebrating the actual death of the hostages themselves. People need to realize, from their perspective, they've seen, I think every single Palestinian family probably in Gaza has lost one, if not more, relatives. They're celebrating the return of Palestinian prisoners out of Israeli concentration camps and prisons. And if this means the exchange of bodies of Israelis, then they're happy for that. They're not actually celebrating the deaths of these various hostages. They're celebrating the return of their loved ones from these prisons and these dungeons in which the Israelis have openly, and we have footage of that, which is quite, I think, disturbing, Israelis torturing these Palestinian people without any trials or any sort of proper judicial proceedings. So this is, I think, the optics here. And on the ground in Gaza, you have to keep in mind, it may have looked a bit gnarly how all of the Palestinians were sort of celebrating, cheering as the bodies were handed over to the Red Cross. But see, from their perspective, they've seen tens of thousands of their own children perish in bombardments, in apartments and rubble, etc., and even dying from starvation, as we saw this humanitarian crisis develop over the last year and a half. They're completely desensitized. Right? They're living in an apocalyptic World War III type scenario, very truly, right? Similar to, I think, certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk, which is why you see the most hardiest people fighting in their Samoa, at least the beginning of it, were those from Donetsk and Lugansk. I mean, it was the literal Donetsk forces which took Mariupol at the beginning and which fought the most extreme and the most hardcore Ukrainian troops in that city, including the Azov battalion. It's those who have seen war and who've lived through it for over a year, literally on their own homeland. Their, of course, their views of what exactly optics are and what's the most diplomatically correct way to behave is, of course, very different to most of us who live in, frankly, peaceful countries, at least for now, since as the Third World War really hasn't expanded to our homelands. But keep in mind, these Palestinians are, of course, cheering on. And this has been framed, again, as an excuse for Netanyahu to reignite the tension in Gaza. And the hopeful thing is, Conrad, is that this footage of all these Hamas fighters actually standing there with their weapons, it's showing that Hamas as an organization and as the Palestinians and those who join Hamas are actually still a very potent force. There's thousands of them still around. Israel hasn't destroyed Hamas. There are reports from all kinds of Zionists, even in Russian media, they're saying that Hamas is completely being destroyed and the organization doesn't exist anymore. That's not what the footage is showing. In fact, it's showing that many more, probably even younger Palestinians have joined the organization, have been training in these tunnels and in some of these secret facilities all over the Gaza Strip, especially those areas which Israel hasn't occupied yet. And they're prepared for a second wave of conflict if it arises. And naturally, this is, again, the reflection in the mirror is also what's happening in southern Lebanon, in which, again, the agreement was that Hezbollah would, again, go north of the Litani River and abandon those particular southern outposts, and Israel would return to its Israeli lands. Neither of those two things have happened. You still see Lebanese citizens, civilians continue to die. And this was supposed to, of course, this agreement was supposed to commence and finalize at the end of January. So as we see this funeral of Nasrallah being planned for the 23rd of February, just the Sunday, I think we're going to see, again, a potential reignition of affairs in the Lebanese front because the Israeli troops are still there on Lebanese territory. And again, the rhetoric coming out of Netanyahu, I think, is understanding as these court proceedings against him are progressing and as the world is somewhat focused on Ukraine, once again, because Zelensky is making such reckless statements. Again, notice these two Zionist Jewish leaders essentially almost playing like a seesaw, sort of bent like a pendulum swings. Who gets more attention? Netanyahu or Zelensky? At the moment, Zelensky seems to be attracting more criticism. So Netanyahu has more freedom perhaps to act. And again, he has that, I guess, moral backing from the new Syrian occupied government, which simply hasn't even commented on the fact that Israel still occupies so much land of Syria, which again, he could only have dreamed of taking during the government of Bashar al-Assad, right? So there's a lot of tension happening on the ground, and the expansion into the West Bank now has become not just a threat or some sort of conspiracy of a future great Israel. It's happening right now, and these free bus explosions, again, it's a black swan, I would say red flag, like the 9/11 bombing, again, which turned out to be essentially be an inside job by the George W. Bush government, most likely with the assistance of Mossad and the CIA. So it's very concerning as to what will happen in the West Bank. And the West Bank has a lot more Christians living there than in the Gaza Strip. So we should be additionally concerned as to what exactly will take place in these settlements. And mind you, the Jewish settlers who actually move into these West Bank territories, these are the people who slain and martyred Saint Philomenos of Jacob's Well. These are radical settlers who want to expand that territory surrounding Jerusalem and these other holy sites, Bethlehem, etc. These are areas which Christians have built monasteries and churches on, have gone to pilgrimage to for generations now, right? Centuries at this point. So these are areas which are directly, I suppose, in the sphere of not only Russia's influence, but also just Christian influence in general, including the Roman Catholics, who I think should start waking up to the reality of what exactly is taking place. What is the Vatican's position on the state of Israel? What is philo-Semitism? And I think this is a big wake-up call, not just to the Protestants like Greg Locke and all these other weirdo pastors, evangelicals. I think the entire Christian world should really start waking up, and hopefully before it's not too late. Do we really need an on-the-ground genocide of West Bank Palestinians for us to understand that the Netanyahu regime and Zionism in general is a terroristic ideology, and the regime itself is simply a personification, like a crystallization of these dark tendencies to reestablish the kingdom of the Antichrist, who will be from the tribe of Dan. He will be a Jew by blood. He will be circumcised, and he will rule these people and essentially try to rule the entire world through the globalism, which they're trying to establish through their various cells across various nations. And this is just a summary of globalist world affairs at this point, Conrad, but it is being determined at the moment, I think, in the West Bank as the Israelis and unfortunately the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, who, again, he does travel to Russia a lot. Mahmoud Abbas does pretend to be this BRICS multipolar character, but I think is very much on the payroll for some of these Israeli behind-the-scenes actors, unfortunately. So who will stand up for the Palestinians? That is the biggest question. Will it be Hezbollah? Will Iran again rear its head and defend the innocence of the West Bank? And hopefully the peace in Gaza does continue. But at the moment, Conrad, it does seem like any excuse Netanyahu can get to reestablish and to re-demonize the Palestinians there will be utilized by him, because these people are very pragmatic. They stick to realpolitik angles, and they're very predatory in their foreign political aspirations on Palestinian territory. So very concerning situation there in the Holy Land.
No, I agree. And unfortunately, as you said, so many more Christians in the West Bank. And I fear that, we're hearing more reports of desecrated churches, Catholic and Orthodox, still coming out of southern Lebanon, especially as these Israeli forces retreat. Journalists are able to go into some of these towns, and we're seeing some horrible things. Icons and statues of Christ and the Theotokos have been desecrated, defecation and whatnot occurring on and near altars. So keep the whole situation in your prayers, of course, as the synagogue of Satan continues to attack Christ's children across the earth. But we have to transition, of course, to Africa. A few different fronts going on. Some of the biggest news being that Khalifa Haftar, the head of the Libyan National Army, which is the group that controls the most territory right now in Libya, all of the territory on Egypt's border over to Benghazi. They just don't control the far western portion, which is where the Tripoli-based, Turkish-backed government currently operates. But Haftar was able to visit Lukashenko in Belarus, and there's rumors that he will be buying MiG-29s or Su-30s that LNA pilots have been trained on. We have seen footage of Russian jets in Libyan airspace in the past, and he was accompanied by his son, Saddam Haftar, who's the commander of one of the brigades of his army, clearly indicating perhaps that his son is his successor, indicating that he has a line of succession ready to create a stable form of government in Libya, even in the event that he dies. Because, none of these people that have been involved in these Libyan conflicts are young men at this point. These have been going on for decades and decades. Obviously, the fact that Haftar, in the past has even been supported by the United States. It's one of the more interesting proxy situations, again, pointing to a reality where the US and Russia do have warmer relations, and they then confront Turkey due to a myriad of other reasons. But of course, this is Libya, Syria. It's one of the main fronts where Russian and Turkish proxies have clashed in the past. So I hope at least that this can facilitate a full victory for Haftar, and that the Libya situation can get brought under control, because that would also be a huge boon for Europe, because if Libya had a stable government, a lot of these boats and African migrants would be able to be stopped, because that was initially what Gaddafi was doing, and that was part of the Jewish plan to take him out, which of course did also go against Russian interests. People accuse Russia and Belarus of facilitating the Great Replacement into Europe, when in reality the Russian and Belarusian sphere of influence was holding back a lot of replacement migration. And of course, Poland isn't doing itself any favors by aggressively going against Belarus on its border. Of course, Belarus is going to open the floodgates to defend itself. I don't support it, but it makes sense if you're going to press them. And of course, if Haftar can take over in Libya, then we could see perhaps the gate above the Sahara closed again, which would be really amazing for the demographics of Europe. But the real big situation going on in Africa, of course, is the continued advance of M23 and their Rwandan supporters in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. They are advancing rapidly. I think they've taken even more than the huge territory they had taken, as we had discussed in our previous episode. At this point, the Rwandans are about to take a territory larger than Rwanda in itself. And of course, this part of Congo is very much separated by road or rail. There's no paved road connections to the rest of Congo. The capital, Kinshasa, is all the way across the country. And this is also the most mineral-rich part of the whole Congo, especially regarding gold, tin, and coltan, which for those that don't know what coltan is, it's a critical component for electronics, I think like cell phones and microchips and some of these other things. And the largest amount of coltan in the world is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, specifically right near the border with Rwanda. And of course, Burundi, the country to Rwanda south, they are fighting on the side of the DRC. But Uganda, the much more militarily powerful country to Rwanda's north, are siding with Rwanda. And of course, they are attempting to annex, I think, some of this territory eventually in the DRC under the guise of protecting ethnic minorities there, specifically Tutsi minorities, that Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, is a member of that ethnic group. They were the group targeted by the Hutus in the Rwandan genocide. And of course, that's why Burundi is helping the Congo, because they have a Hutu majority government. They are even supporting Hutu terrorist militias, which ironically, the existence of those militias was the pretext for the M23 militia to be in these regions of the Congo to begin with. So it's all just a big self-fulfilling proxy, with the ultimate goal being the obtaining of these gold, tin, and coltan mines, which are critical. Of course, DRC used to be pretty much the only coltan exporter in the world, but in the past few years, Rwanda has surpassed them due to the fact that they have wrestled the mines of coltan in these regions away from DRC. And DRC, again, not really a real country. It probably does need to be balkanized at a certain level. The Kinshasa government has never been able to maintain centralized control over any of these regions. And again, these places aren't even accessible by road or rail. So M23 and the Rwandans, which Rwanda has an extensive road and rail network right across the border, are able to get their troops all the way over there super fast before the DRC can even do anything. And of course, the head of the Ugandan military is likely to take over from his father when he dies as president of Uganda. And it appears that the Ugandan Rwandan forces together will likely be able to win. People are discussing this becoming the Third Congo War, a successor to the Second Congo War, which was fought from 1998 to 2005. It's considered the bloodiest conflict to be fought since World War II, with 3 to 5 million supposedly dead. And back then, of course, in the aftermath of that, Rwanda had been, sanctioned in 2012 when Rwanda tried to do a very similar thing and take Goma and these other territories in the eastern DRC with the M23 militia. They were sanctioned and they ultimately were forced to stop their operations because they couldn't handle what they were doing with the sanctions and pulling back of aid from the US, the UK, and France, which every African country relies on. But at this point, since 2012, in the 13 years since all of that went down, Rwanda has become sort of, they call it the Singapore of Africa. They're the number two donor of troops to UN foreign missions, the number one in Africa. They protect French strategic interests with oil in Mozambique. They operate peacekeeping forces in Central African Republic, Sudan, a lot of these other places. So they have a lot more leverage now, and these Western powers are not as eager to sanction them. In some places, people even think France might be willing to let them just do whatever they want in the DRC. However, the US has come out and sanctioned certain retired generals from the Rwandan military. I think the assumption being that some of these retired military figures are serving and providing strategic advice to the M23 militia. So the situation in the DRC is escalating. If this continues as it does, and the militia continues to take more territory and the DRC doesn't have a government collapse of some kind, I wouldn't be surprised if people start referring to this as the Third African World War very soon. And I think the real question is, where will Russia come into this? Because as far as I can tell, Russia is not super involved in this, especially not as involved as they are in all of the ECOWAS stuff, of course, with Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, all those places where Wagner is very active, and of course the situation between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese military junta, where the Russians have now finally come fully down in support of the junta due to them promising that Red Sea port that Russia has been looking for so strongly. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Africa situation, Dimitri, before we transition to talking about some stuff in the Far East and China, as well as some domestic stuff here in the United States.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about this Rwandan issue is that the United Nations Security Council has openly, collectively condemned the particular situation of M23, of course, intervening in DRC, capturing some of these cities like Goma and Bukavu, and essentially spreading and carrying out this sort of militant vigilante type justice in the DRC, essentially a sovereign country. It's very interesting how both Russia and China support the Myanmar junta in some capacity, again, taking control in a country, and Russian SMO, of course, not being supported by the Security Council in whatever capacity. But when the Africans try to carry out their own justice, they're being suppressed, again, by the Russians and Chinese. So there is that double standard here where it's like, well, the Africans aren't allowed to carry out the special military operations, but civilized countries, so-called first world countries, those belonging to the Security Council are. So we understand the United Nations over the last few years has completely dropped any of its legitimacy. The ICC especially isn't really seen as some sort of authoritative body. All of these international relations, instantiations, and organizations that were meant to keep the world in check in the post-Cold War era have, of course, been determined as essentially ineffective. So whatever the Security Council says at this point will be completely irrelevant. I think the Rwandan government, as well as the M23 group in and of itself, will continue carrying out whatever it seems fit to do in DRC. And yeah, as you said correctly, Conrad, DRC has over 100 ethnicities, different tribes. It really is this confederacy of different tribes and literally no cohesion whatsoever. And in fact, I think the M23 statements that there actually are criminals hiding in the DRC is completely plausible, especially if they, of course, those who enacted the genocide in Rwanda in the first place escaped with some sort of monetary backing. They could easily hide in those Central African jungles. So there's some real concerns, and I think it's a bit hypocritical that China and Russia, of course, join on the Security Council, so trying to keep the peace in Africa, where we both understand, I think, that the M23 will continue to act unimpeded and there won't be any United Nations intervention into this African crisis, similar as there wasn't one in the 1990s when the genocide was raging on. One of the greatest failures of the United Nations, I think, in its history, besides, of course, the bombing of Yugoslavia, etc., and the dissolution of that particular communist state. I think another chapter of the United Nations falling apart. And frankly, it's the entire organization in and of itself, just like the League of Nations was very Masonic. And it does have there's very good reason, I think, for it to lose credibility in world affairs. And just as we've seen Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, I think now the world is returning to this multipolar treaty type pre-World War I situation where countries will come together in certain neutral states such as Saudi Arabia and organize treaties and peace talks amongst themselves rather than depending on this unfortunate international body, which has frankly failed, I think, the entire world and some of its like long-term aspirations. And at the moment, we do see, for example, a cooling on the Horn of Africa of Somaliland, Somalia, and Ethiopia. But as soon as that particular conflict reignites once again and peace talks fail, and of course, when the world enters into a certain recession, those particular countries will also not see any sort of support from the United Nations. I think Africa has been one of those front lines that has completely failed the African people first and foremost in keeping the peace. And the Sahel is one of these examples, Conrad, like Burkina Faso and Mali, countries which have organized in amongst themselves to organize a defense of their own lands against these Islamic extremists and all these other Tuareg tribesmen who are somewhat extreme in their own nature in order to defend themselves first and foremost and not depend on international bodies. So I think it's quite interesting. We'll continue to watch the M23 situation play out. And just my thoughts on the entire situation, if Russia does come out in support of M23 and in support of Rwanda, we may see a similar thing to what's happening in Myanmar quite recently, where the Russian Orthodox Church was granted permission to open up its own exarchate in the country of Myanmar, and Metropolitan Sergius traveled there, and the junta ends up, of course, collaborating with the Russian Orthodox Church, and they said, look, we're going to allow evangelism and proselytism, orthodoxy of the Russian Orthodox Church in the land. So there are hopes
total vindication for day one junta supporters like me, so we love to see it.
Exactly. So it ties directly into, I suppose, world affairs. If a certain powerful nation seems to want to push out for justice, I think countries like Russia and China really should embrace that because, frankly, these countries of themselves, China with its interests in Taiwan, Russia with its very close interests, I would say, in countries like Syria, fighting against the terrorists for over a decade, and in Ukraine, it's exactly what they're doing. So I think it's the wrong time to be hypocritical at this point. Leave that to the Jews, leave that to Netanyahu, Zelensky, and even certain people in the Trump administration.
Well, speaking of hypocrisy and bad decisions and persecutions, I want to read this from Joost Strijdom, the spokesperson for Orania. This is about South Africa and their expropriation of land without compensation bill, which of course got them sanctioned and condemned and got the Boer granted refugee status by the United States in Trump's executive order that we talked about in previous weeks. But Joost says the ANC government in South Africa is doubling down on land expropriation. A shocking new bill was just announced, land expropriation based on majority demographics. That means land ownership must reflect the demographics of South Africa. The Department of Land Reform and Rural Development announced today to the relevant Parliamentary Portfolio Committee that the so-called Equitable Access to Land bill will be introduced this year. The idea is to rush it through before the end of the year so that neither department nor the Portfolio Committee is making a secret of the fact that this bill specifically targets land ownership by white Afrikaners. They regard it as part of the freedom struggle that was left unfinished in 1994. This is another way of saying they've decided to unilaterally suspend that settlement in yet another way. Dr. Wynand Boshoff, Member of Parliament for the Freedom Front Plus, sent out a press release after the announcement of the committee. Negotiations in the 90s between the previous government and the ANC were based on two basic foundational agreements. Afrikaners can keep land that was their property, and Afrikaners can have their own educational institutions and schools. In the past few months, both of these agreements fell victim to the ANC's dishonesty. If some Afrikaners want to leave South Africa, I completely understand, and though saddened, wish them well. Joost, of course, is one of the Iranians who, again, they don't want to leave. They want Western Cape independence. They want a sort of regional autonomous zone that eventually Orania would become a sort of capital figure for, and I think that is a noble goal. And if that place were to exist and were to actually be allowed to become the first world country it would, I think it would have a positive reverberation across all of Africa. So I don't even think that the Bantu that are angrily trying to steal all this land should actually be against this. We saw what happened in Zimbabwe. They had to beg the white people to come back. So this is all just going that way that we all know it does, where black people try to steal stuff from whites, try to run things themselves, and they just can't do it. So that's what's going on here. But unfortunately, our favorite diplomat Lavrov had some fairly unfortunate things to say about this at the G20 summit, which I don't know if you have any comments about that, Dmitry.
Yeah, I think Lavrov essentially stating that, again, alluding to white supremacy. I think it's one of the most bizarre statements that he's made in recent months. Again, Lavrov, we do state, Conrad, very openly that he's a skilled diplomatician. He's been probably the most experienced Russian in the foreign ministry. But at the moment, blaming white supremacy for some of the conflicts and the events taking place in BRICS countries, especially like that of South Africa, which we understand is a country with huge injustice, especially towards the white population and the post-apartheid sort of revenge that the regime is taking, and even more extreme forces like Julius Malema, for example, a very strange character supported by people like Jackson Hinkle. I just think Lavrov in particular really needs to back off. This is not what multipolarity is about. It's not about supporting anti-white talking points. It's about actually promoting sovereign nations around the world and cultures to actually develop and achieve sovereignty in and of themselves, right?
Yeah, no, I think obviously I can understand what Lavrov is saying because South Africa is a very close ally with Russia, even regarding the whole Zionism thing. And I'm even more aware that, yes, there is an unfortunate connection between the South African apartheid regime and the Zionist entity. Even deeper than that, there's some influence on the United States. You look at Elon Musk, white South African, born in apartheid South Africa. You look at David Sachs, one of the big donors to Donald Trump, host of the All In podcast, South African Peter Thiel, studied in South Africa, Joel Pollack, editor of Breitbart, Jew from South Africa. So there's an unfortunate connection here, and we do realize that who, of course, provided Israel with its enriched nuclear material and allowed them to test the nuke. It was, of course, the apartheid regime in South Africa. And, of course, it makes sense why Israel would want to maintain a sort of crypto relationship with the apartheid regime and kind of bolster them internationally because they themselves are trying to do an even more cruel and nonsensical form of apartheid in the West Bank and Palestine. And I don't view the situations as comparable at all. I believe that both races under apartheid South Africa were benefiting more than they would have otherwise. Meanwhile, of course, the Palestinians were there the entire time. The Israelis just came in and decided to segregate them due to their lack of subservience to their sacred ethno-religion. And of course, we know how many Christians got caught up in the Nakba as well. So I don't think the two situations are analogous. However, as much as I hate Lavrov's coal, I do recognize that there is an underlying geopolitical situation. And unfortunately, there is a Zionist, white South African apartheid exile sort of connection that is actually having an ongoing influence in American politics. But speaking of American politics, of course, Kash Patel was confirmed as the head of the FBI. All the while, the head of ICE was finally fired by Trump due to supposed low daily deportation numbers. Those have fallen to about 300, 350 a day, which is pathetic as of this point. The Trump administration, if they don't dramatically increase things, they are on track to deport only 1.2 million illegal immigrants at the end of this term, which again, that is barely 1/10 of the amount of illegals that were even allowed in under Joe Biden. So that is simply unacceptable, and we're going to have to increase those numbers, and hopefully this new ICE chief will facilitate that. Obviously, Kash Patel is supposedly going to be cleaning house at the FBI. There's rumor that Pam Bondi, his boss, has the Epstein list on her desk. So be sure to keep up with the World War Now social media. There's going to be a lot of stories here on the domestic front. But again, as much as Trump is really maxing out his executive function, at this point, we are kind of reaching the end of the rope and need to see legislative action. There needs to be legislative action to allocate money to ICE. There needs to be legislative action regarding birthright citizenship. There needs to be legislative action regarding the wall. And I think there needs to be legislative action regarding some foreign policy stuff as well. Of course, industry, very much so, but the foreign policy stuff, I am not confident in the legislature's ability to do that. Obviously, all of these Zionist representatives at this point are openly talking about turning Gaza into glass over the fake news story about the supposedly tortured and killed hostages that, again, we already discussed were just killed by Israel. So that's the kind of the situation here on the home front in short. But we have to talk about China, what's going on there. China is doing some hot live-fire military exercises about closest to Australia they've ever done it. They're doing more and more exercises off the South Thomas Shoal in what they claim are their territorial waters between the Philippines and Australia, where Vietnam claims its territorial waters. So China very much making moves. I think as things are toning down in Ukraine, China is aware of that same thing that Lukashenko said earlier, which is that if all these China hawks are toning things down in Ukraine, there's going to be a huge pivot eastwards to try to get Taiwan perhaps back in the U.S. sphere of influence. Perhaps there'll be a pivot in Myanmar, which again, obviously the Myanmar junta, they have made some advances with their new Russian planes and whatnot, but it's still very much a very dynamic situation there as rebels take things and they take things back. And it's a very messy guerrilla Vietnam tier conflict there in Indochina. But if China is preparing, of course, for increased U.S. pressure, perhaps sanctions, potential new trade wars, new manufacturing battles as the U.S. tries to rebuild its manufacturing base. Of course, Trump has talked about sanctioning Taiwan, realizing that ultimately Chinese and Taiwanese reunification is inevitable. And if the U.S. is going to remain dependent on Chinese fab production, then we're totally screwed. So he's trying to bring these things back to the U.S. He's going to try to not have us be as dependent on Taiwan. But ultimately, a lot of these people in his cabinet are China hawks. We talked about the whole Marco Rubio memo plan from his DOD about how, or rather from his Department of State, about how China is going to block and blow up the Panama Canal, block the Suez Canal, take Taiwan in this sort of shock and awe situation. But again, I really hope that Russia doesn't kind of take the cheese and come back into the U.S. sphere of influence to be a sort of junior partner with them against China, because I don't think that will go very well. And I think that puts Putin's successor in huge danger of potentially being the one that oversees the Gunter Fellinger Jewish balkanization of Russia that so many people have talked about for so long. But unless you have anything to say about the China situation, Dmitry, we do need to talk about what's going on in the church in Ukraine. Final thing on China, of course, there was their second test flight of their new 6th generation fighter, which there's some pictures of this thing. It's crazy looking. It looks like a sort of UFO of sorts, but there was also footage from the South China Sea from a Filipino boat, again, all around the Thomas Shoal area, and a Chinese helicopter got within 3 meters of a Filipino ship. So the provocations down there continue as, of course, Philippines and other U.S. proxies in the region are not allowing China to expand its territorial waters. And before I hand it over to Dmitry to talk about the situation in Ukraine, and the church, of course, I want to get his thoughts on the upcoming elections in Germany, which, again, by the time you all are listening to this, they will already be either be ongoing or a lot of results will very much be in. And the current polls right now have in first place the Christian Democratic Union, Merkel's party, now, of course, led by Merz. It has at 29.4%. Second place, we got the AfD at 20.6%. And this is a Reuters poll amalgamator. And then you have, of course, the SPD, the Socialists under Olaf Scholz at 15.4%. The Greens at 13.1%. You seem to have Der Linke has rocketed up slightly to 6.7%. Then you have the other parties, the BSW, who there's a chance that they might ally with the AfD at 4.7%, and then a few other small parties. I'm shocked at the SPD and the Greens having over 10% support in the midst of all of this. At the end of the day, the people that live in German cities are just insane levels of cucks. It's just, there's no other way to explain this. And of course, the real question is, will the AfD outperform and overperform expectations, potentially even coming first, which would be best case scenario? I don't think that's very likely. But if they don't do that and get very, very close second place, perhaps the CDU gets something like 28%, AfD gets something like 25%, 26%, then that might be enough of a victory for the Christian Democrats, the center-right party, to be forced into a coalition government with the AfD, which would be really good. However, the fear that if that happens is that they will simply empower all of the moderates in the AfD, the Alice Weidel Western AfD branch of the party, and completely disempower, potentially even get them booted from the party, the true right-wing members of the party, Bjorn Hake, the Eastern AfD, the people that actually win all of the elections, that give the AfD all of its support, the people that are also actually aware of the demographic situation and the Great Replacement, and also want to reduce Germany's flagellatory support for Israel that only exists due to their guilt over the Holocaust narrative, which at this point, thankfully, is, I think, being rolled back in a lot of people's consciousness as they realize, I mean, one, that it's bullshit, or two, that it really doesn't matter, because at this point, we're getting to the point where most people that were alive for that are no longer with us, and it's time for civilization states to move forward. But my prediction is that the AfD will do better than 20%. Again, this could just be wishful thinking and wish casting, because anything could happen. We know that there will be a full court press to steal the election from them, but characters like Elon Musk, JD Vance have come out supporting them. So I believe the AfD will get over 20%. I believe that will happen. And I think the Christian Democrats will do slightly less good than projected, because the AfD will make up for it. I'm hoping any other smaller right-wing parties will do well. Also, and I also predict the SPD and the Greens will slightly underperform the polls. That's my prediction. Could be totally wrong. Can't say I'm an expert on German electoral politics. But Dimitri, what are your thoughts on this upcoming German election? And then we can switch to church persecution.
No, of course, just briefly, Conrad, I agree with your assessment, but we do see, of course, the subversion of even the right wing in Germany. As much as we want the AfD to win, and I completely agree, just like with the election of Donald J. Trump, it would be the best case scenario, despite the fact that Trump and his administration, the people around him, his own family, they're not perfect. The AfD is far from perfect. They're being led by Alice Weidel, essentially a German lesbian, right? Her sort of adherence to some sort of Christian conservatism is probably far removed. But in any case, the AfD is probably the best shot that the German people have at actually having, for the first time in their lengthy history, a conservative government, at least since the Second World War, that is primarily focused on, again, deporting illegals, deporting so-called refugees, deporting even probably legal migrants who commit crimes, right? In particular, there's all kinds of displaced people from the Middle East, unfortunately, due to the various Zionist and extremely Wahhabi groups that have caused mischief in the Middle East. They've forced this huge migration, again, under the government of Angela Merkel herself, into Germany. And now almost on a weekly basis, there are terrorist acts taking place in Germany by these so-called asylum seekers. So the AfD winning, and again, you do see why Elon Musk, people like this support the AfD, because, again, it distracts us from Zionist crime and kind of points to the sort of, just like with the Pakistani gangs, which again are a real phenomenon. These, Islamic terror, again, in European countries is absolutely real. These grooming gangs, these Pakistanis, they're completely a real phenomenon. It's just how these things being framed, they're being utilized in order to distract from the crimes committed by the Zionists. And again, no one's really asking who are the governments letting these people in the first place. So the AfD, we are hoping for a victory. It'll be a long shot based on the polls at the moment. But in any case, what will be the aftermath, Conrad? I think we can only speculate. Will Elon Musk call for a re-election online on X, for example? Will there be some sort of disputing of the election? Will Germany have its own Reichstag January 6th moment, right? I think the cards are very much in play at the moment as to what exactly will take place. How will the right wing react to maybe a stolen election in the German parliament? So there's a lot of very plausible scenarios, and there will be accusations of Russian meddling in the election. If the AfD do very well, you can put money on that. I think it's a very clear bet, and they will be accusing Putin of course, intervening. And Germany at the moment is economically suffering quite drastically. The energy prices they've gone up 2-3 times what they were before the SMO, of course, with the failure of the Nord Streams, the terror acts, and all this other energy sabotage taking place, most likely under the influence of Ukraine. All of this will deeply affect the election. So we hope for an alternative for Germany victory, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind it will be similar to a Trump victory, as in most likely the AfD, similar to Giorgia Meloni's party in Italy, it will be somewhat, maybe slightly pro-Ukrainian and definitely pro-Zionist and pro-Israel. So that is the only concerning thing. But we will analyze that, of course, after the elections take place and talk about exactly what positions these AfD parliamentarians have on the Middle East and on European development generally. Is it a push towards conservatism, or is this just a placeholder, a mandate for populism in Europe, maybe in a more, shall we say, 20th century sense? So we'll just be definitely observing that. In relation to Ukraine, of course, the persecution continues, and there's a lot more news from this week. In particular, the renaming of the Lavra Street, and this is one of the main streets in Kiev. In fact, before the revolution in Russia, this particular street in Kiev, and this, of course, the street leads onto many museums, including the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, actually is located, the entry into the monastery is located on one of these main streets in Kiev. And the street itself, before the revolution, was called the Street of St. Nicholas, Nikolskaya Ulitsa. The reason why is because there was a huge Baroque cathedral built in the 1690s on this street. And mind you, it's called the St. Nicholas Military Cathedral. It looked like, if I was to describe it to listeners, like a Notre Dame, but in a very Baroque 17th century fashion style. So an Orthodox Christian cathedral, and very fantastic. Unfortunately, it no longer stands. And can you imagine why, Conrad? Did the Third Reich destroy it? They blow it up during the occupation of Kiev? No, it was blown up by the government of Joseph Jugashvili Stalin in 1934 and since not rebuilt. This giant cathedral of 230 years, destroyed by the Soviets for no reason whatsoever in 1934. 7 years prior to Operation Barbarossa, and since not rebuilt. And the name of the street was actually changed after the revolution to 1st February Revolution Street, and then it was changed to Ivan Mazepa Street. And as we remember, Ivan Mazepa, he was the one of the Ukrainian Cossack leaders during the time of Peter the Great, and he actually swore allegiance to Tsar Peter during the invasion of Ukraine and Russia by the Swedish Protestant army of Charles XII during the Battle of Poltava. And Ivan Mazepa, actually, he kissed the gospel and the cross, which is a very old Russian and even Byzantine Roman tradition of essentially battle commanders swearing fealty to a particular Tsar or emperor. They would swear on the cross and the gospel, kiss the holy items, and essentially swear allegiance to their leader. Mazepa betrayed that oath and essentially turned and began assisting the Swedish Protestant invaders, leading a few thousand Cossacks against Tsar Peter the Great. After this particular conflict in the Battle of Poltava, the Orthodox Church of Russia anathematized Mazepa, essentially excommunicating him formally. And in fact, the anathema of Mazepa continues to this day. And notice the name of an anathematized traitor to Christianity, a traitor against Orthodoxy, is essentially the name of this new street. And so the Lavra Street has been renamed again to the Street of Mazepa, unfortunately. The reason it was Lavra Street temporarily was because the government of Yanukovych in 2010 and 11 tried to change the street to something a bit more, but maybe not St. Nicholas Street again, like in the past, but something a bit more down the middle, which the people could agree with. And now the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra is, of course, occupied by Ukraine, so it does very fit. The city of Kiev itself, I think, should be definitely discussed when we talk about the persecutions, because it's right in this is where the government, this criminal government is located, and we can see the persecution there very obviously. Some of the other cities that are affected by recent persecution news is, of course, the city of Cherkasy with Metropolitan Theodosius, who's been harassed, beaten. Remember, we all saw that footage of the Archangel Michael Cathedral being occupied and taken by the Ukrainian militias, the police not stepping in, not defending it. Apparently, there was a very old copy of the Kazan Theotokos icon inside of that cathedral, which people of Metropolitan Theodosius, also the mayor of Cherkasy accuses him, have taken from the cathedral prior to it being occupied. And again, miracle-working icons shouldn't be handed over to these very schismatics and militiamen who occupied the church. And now the mayor of Cherkasy has stated that is openly essentially putting out a warrant on anyone who has this icon of the Kazan Theotokos. So now the Ukrainians, Anatoly Bondarenko, the mayor of Cherkasy, is openly searching for the miracle-working icon so that he could potentially desecrate it by placing it into some sort of schismatic church. Again, very concerning. So we can see not just the relics are being chased after and being paraded as sort of items that can be taken, but also miracle-working old icons as well. Very concerning. And this was all reflected upon in the really good interview that I think everybody should really listen to from Robert Amsterdam that he gave, of course, with Tucker Carlson. And about 28 minutes of that interview are dedicated to the persecution of the Orthodox Church. Robert Amsterdam is essentially a Jewish lawyer who is Jewish American, and he's an expert in humanitarian law, in particular international law. And he's been openly defending the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Metropolitan Onufry. So this is the canonical church in Ukraine against the persecutors of Christianity like Zelensky, his government, the OCU. And he openly gave a very interesting statistic. He said that since the beginning, essentially, of the SMO, over 1,500 churches have been stolen or occupied by the schismatic OCU. So this is incredibly concerning. Notice that's almost 10% of the churches in all of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian schismatics definitely have been active over the last 3 years. And we say 3 years because literally this weekend, Conrad, it is the 3 anniversary of the special military operation. And of course, we can kind of see the sentiment of these schismatic bishops in an interview. It seems like on a weekly basis, this right-hand man of Sergius, false Metropolitan Epiphany, seems to give very bizarre opinions. Metropolitan Alexander Drabinko, and I say Metropolitan very casually here, he's the main persecutor of Christianity besides Epiphany himself. In the interview, he actually states to Ukrainian journalists that he expects that after the war with Russia ends, many Ukrainian soldiers will begin committing suicide. He says that they are so traumatized by the Russian invasion that their spiritual state will lead them into essentially mass suicide, mass depression, PTSD, trauma. And I was just taken aback by this. Instead of maybe proposing some sort of solution or programs, he simply states that it's Russia's invasion that has scarred these Ukrainian people. And he doesn't even mention the fact that many of these unfortunate Ukrainian soldiers have been forcefully conscripted and drafted into service, essentially fighting against their own brothers in the Russian army. So very evil sort of statement from him, and he doesn't even, he's almost smiling in the interview as he says that, which is quite demonic of him. And there was a strong reaction, Conrad, to the release of the calendar by the Russian church from, the Moscow Patriarch calendar for 2025, which of course lists all the hierarchs of Ukraine, the canonical ones, as members of the Russian Orthodox Church. There was an open statement from the Amvon after the Sunday service at the end of last week from the bishop and the priest of Chernovice in the cathedral. This is a particular diocese just in the really far western side of Ukraine, right next to Moldova and Romania. So as you can imagine, they're very susceptible to persecution at any time, very far from Russia, very far from any particular pro-Orthodox Christian forces that can protect them. And the bishop of Chernovice and the priest, they openly proclaim that they don't belong to the Russian church whatsoever. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has zero connection to Russia, and they made that proclamation very openly. So as you can see, the persecution, as it ramps up, it really forces a lot of Ukrainians to actually break themselves off and disconnect themselves from the general umbrella of the Orthodox Church of Moscow, which, again, this goes against the long-standing tradition. And this is why we see them stop venerating certain Russian saints, taking them out of their prayer books, the church calendars, etc., because the Russification committed by the Zelensky government has also affected the church. Perhaps the most egregious interview that we saw this week, and this is quite disgusting. I posted about it on X and even tried to censor some of the statements. There was a weird, really short in stature, Danny DeVito-looking Jewish journalist outside of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, commenting on the fact that the Russian forces had begun venerating a relic of Ilya Muromets. This is Saint Ilya Muromets, the great warrior of Russian folklore who defeated so many enemies of Russia during the time of Saint Vladimir, who baptized Russians, essentially like the Russian Beowulf of legends. And he essentially, at the end of his life, became a monk and passed away in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. So the relics of this Saint Ilya, Saint Elijah are still lying in the Lavra itself. But one of the pieces of the relics, in particular, the middle finger of Ilya Muromets' left hand, is actually located in Murom, which is a city in far southeastern Russia, near Ryazan, one of the first cities. This is where Saints Peter and Fevronia were from, those famous two saints of married couples. And that particular finger, that relic, was separated from the body of Saint Ilya Muromets hundreds of years ago, and it was brought over to Murom, which is a city which was named after the saint. And what's curious here is that relic was being taken to Russian cities like Donetsk, Lugansk, venerated by the Russian soldiers. And this Ukrainian Jewish journalist openly says Ilya Muromets is not a real saint. He calls him, he says very obscene things, using the F word, says it's a Russian saint, calls him a venerable F word openly. He even points his middle finger in front of the cathedral of the Lavra and says that it's quite hilarious that the middle finger of a saint is being used as a relic, when in fact I don't think Russians ever paid attention to the fact which finger of the saint it was, and the relic in particular. But this Jew found it amusing to, of course, attack a Russian Christian saint. And so, again, very disturbing. These people will always use any excuse to demonize the Christian faith, even during so-called peacetime, but of course, especially during persecutions, when the church in Ukraine doesn't really have the freedom to speak out against such statements. So this is why we have to sort of report on it. The other metropolitans around, not just the ones from Chernovice, but there's Metropolitan Vladimir as well as Metropolitan Fyodor. All kinds of Ukrainian metropolitans have been very outspoken. They've stated openly that they're not associated with the Russian church in any capacity. But we have to understand, Conrad, the reason they're saying this is most likely to protect their own flock and their own churches and to essentially continue orthodoxy in the Ukrainian land whilst these peace talks are still ongoing. This is our main concern, that if the freedom of the Russian and essentially the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has not been discussed yet, there's no guarantee that even the Putin government, for example, will guarantee the freedom of religion in Ukraine, at least for the time being, and that will end the persecution. So these metropolitans and bishops are forced to make these very bland sort of statements and in protection of their own flock. And it's very unfortunate that the churches in these local dioceses of Ukraine are brought to this particular state. The persecution continues. The hierarchs are making very clear statements. They don't want their parishes raided. They don't want their cathedrals taken, their icons desecrated, etc., by these Ukrainian militiamen. The danger is always abundant. And so we see Ukrainian hierarchs reacting perhaps incorrectly from maybe a theological, ecclesiological perspective, but it's understandable, I think, in the context, in a similar way to maybe how the Palestinians are reacting to the trading of hostages with Israel. We have to sort of contextualize it. I think it's really important.
I completely agree. And the other main theater right now of persecution, of course, very much connected to the Ukraine situation, is what's going on in Estonia. And of course, the government there is threatening to ban the church entirely and seize the monastery. And this is from Ortho Christian. I'm going to read two pieces here. Abbess Filareta and the sisters from Puktitsa Monastery arrived at the Estonian Parliament building on Monday to submit a petition to maintain the monastery's current status. The legislative body is currently considering amendments to the Churches and Congregation Acts that will ban the Estonian Orthodox Church and the monastery if they don't leave the Moscow Patriarchate. The church is an autonomous body within the Patriarchate, governed from Tallinn, while the monastery is Stavropegial, directly under the Omophorion of His Holiness Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all Russia. Both have repeatedly emphasized that they will abide by their respective statutes, which don't permit them to simply change jurisdiction on their own. They then tried to speak to the parliament speaker. The parliament speaker didn't want to speak to them. They then were able to receive some comments from the representative from the Estonian Interior Ministry, Ringo Ringvi, who commented on the monastery's stance against its forced closure, saying it must either share Estonia's values or remain hostage to the Kremlin and present itself as a victim. You're not victims, the representative claimed, adding, think about the real victims, about what they are experiencing today with your patriarch's approval. According to the judgment of Ringvi, who is a Rastafarian, the Moscow Patriarchate has strayed from Christ's teachings. In a free society, any organization has the right to conduct its activities, but it must conform to the legal order and values of society. So we're getting lectured from Rastafarians. How are Rastafarians in power in Estonia? This dog global American empire has gotten out of control. But the EOC and their Bishop Metropolitan Evgeny, who has had to be in exile in Russia ever since all of this has started, they released a statement. And I'll read the last two paragraphs here. It says, although in the canonical sense we are an autonomous part of the Moscow Patriarchate, this concerns exclusively canonical and Eucharistic unity and does not mean practical management and administration of our church by political or governmental circles of a foreign state. Our church is completely independent in its daily activities, economic decisions, and parish management. All our decisions are made by the governing bodies of the Estonian Church, the Council and Synod, guided by canonical laws and the laws of the Republic of Estonia, and taking into account the needs of local parishes. In anticipation of the open session of the Rikogu Legal Affairs Committee on February 18th, regarding the draft law amending the law on churches and parishes, we call on all participants in the discussion to refrain from unfounded generalizations and hostile accusations that harm public unity and freedom of religion in Estonia. We hope that the discussion of the draft law will take place in a constructive atmosphere, based on facts and respecting the rights and freedoms of all religious associations in the Republic of Estonia, and will not place our law-abiding activities outside the legal field. I'm not confident that will happen. I think, unfortunately for the church, they are very much in a situation that depends on the geopolitical developments in Ukraine. I think if Ukraine takes a big L here and the schismatic OCU gets slapped in the face and are rebuked and begin to recede back into the depths of hell from which they came, I think the Estonians will realize that they need to tone it down, that there's not a real future for the Constantinople-backed church that's also in Estonia because of what happened in Ukraine. And I think that would be... And some other persecution news, of course, comes out of Jerusalem and Israel, where the Armenian Patriarchate is being directly persecuted by the Israeli government. Of course, the patriarchs and heads of the local churches of Jerusalem released a statement. I'll read the first part of it. It says, with great concern, we, the patriarchs and heads of the churches in Jerusalem, stand in steadfast solidarity with the Orthodox Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem in its pursuit of justice against an unjust foreclosure order issued by the municipality of Jerusalem. The actions taken against the Armenian Patriarchate based on an unverified and exorbitant Arnona tax debt are legally dubious and morally unacceptable. It goes on to say, it is inconceivable that Christian institutions whose mission for centuries has been to safeguard faith, serve communities, and preserve the sacred heritage of the Holy Land should now face the threat of property seizure under Israeli administrative measures that disregard due process. Particularly alarming is the municipality's attempt to enforce a debt determination without judicial scrutiny and in defiance of the governmental committee established to negotiate such matters in good faith. This reckless move jeopardizes the Orthodox Armenian Patriarchate and sets a perilous precedent that could imperil Christian institutions throughout the Holy Land. And of course, if you look at a map of Jerusalem around the Temple Mount, there is, of course, the largest Muslim corridor. Right next to it is the Christian corridor. And then on the other side are the two Jewish and Armenian corridors, the Jewish corridor being the other corridor that has direct access to the Temple Mount alongside the Muslim corridor. And of course, while the Armenians are Christians, they do have their own huge, large corner because they've maintained such a strong presence. And the area that is attempting to be foreclosed upon by the Jews makes up almost exactly half of the Armenian corridor itself. It is the headquarters of the Patriarchate in Jerusalem there and would be a huge blow to Christian heritage. Obviously, again, we are not Armenian Apostolic, we are not non-Chalcedonians, but this is, of course, very egregious. We recognize that it is the Armenians and the Jerusalem Patriarchate, those two groups in particular that face the most persecution, I believe, by the Jews in this region. The Catholics get some flack as well, but ultimately the Jews, they really I hear they poop on the side of the Holy Sepulchre. They do the same to the Armenian Patriarchal Center because it is right next to the Jewish corridor. The Armenians share the longest border with the Jewish corridor, so that is why they are coming under the most legal and judicial scrutiny right now from the Jews in Israel. So very unfortunate. We got to pray for the situation there. But finally, I will finish up on some good news. This week has been massive in the world of Orthodox books. And I want to highlight two books that I want everybody in the World War Now audience to buy. That's right. I'm telling you to buy something. Of course, only after you have gone behind the World War Now paywall. So get behind the World War Now paywall, then buy these two books. And these two books are, one of them is by Metropolitan Neophytos, and the other one is by Father Seraphim Rose. Of course, the Father Seraphim Rose book is the third edition of Genesis, Creation, and Early Man. This is something that has been very much anticipated for a long time. This book has been out of print for a very long time. People have had to pay hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of dollars in certain cases to get used copies. I don't know all the details on what this new edition has compared to previous editions, but I'm confident that it will be good. And of course, now you can buy it for the much more reasonable price of $45 directly from St. Herman's Monastery Press, and support the monastery, support the legacy of Father Seraphim Rose, and of course, obtain this amazing work that is, I believe, the gold standard of Orthodox analysis on Darwinism, evolution, and refuting that heresy that ultimately is one of the main demonic forces in our time for cleaving people away from Jesus Christ. And the other huge book that I've ordered 2 copies of these myself already it's called Without Being Crucified, We Will Not Be Resurrected, We Will Not Be Glorified by Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu. This is the first book in the English language of homilies from Metropolitan Neophytos, the first book of anything from Metropolitan Neophytos in the English language. So I want to encourage everybody to get that from Uncut Mountain Press. Big thanks to Father Peter Heers, Gregory Heers for translating this huge work. And I know they have more books from Metropolitan Neophytos, as well as a book about Eldris Galactia and her life and prophecies and miracles coming out in English as well. So those are linked below. Be sure to check those out. Thank you to the translators and book publishers that have given us access to this amazing material that I know will spread the gospel in the English language even more, the Orthodox gospels. So thank you for that. Those will be linked below. I think that's a really great way to end the show. Dimitri, I'd love to hear any last words you have for the audience this week.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for your support. We've had some huge 8th hours recently, great interviews, the episode about St. Constantine the Great, of course, just covering a lot of really deep subjects on both history, geopolitics, and again, religion, Christianity. It's been a really eventful month of February, I think, and coming towards the end of it, we'll make sure to cover all that important news. As the week progresses, keep looking at our Telegram. Of course, keep checking out our X pages, especially the World War Now X page. We'll be posting all about the upcoming German elections, as well as what will take place with the Armenian quarter. Of course, we're all watching that very closely because first they will go after the Armenians, and you best believe that the Jerusalem Patriarchate is most likely next on the chopping block, especially given how these particular enemies of mankind and enemies of God have it out for us Christians in the world. So definitely be checking out our social media pages and as we cover the news this week.
Yeah, with all of that, worldwarnow.co, that is where you can listen to all of our recent Ether Hour discussions and, of course, financially support the show. Those that do make the decision to support us on the Substack are the ones that keep all of this going. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Be sure to like this video as well. If you are not behind the paywall, you can at least like and share the episodes. That, of course, is the next best way to help us. So worldwarnow.co, that is our home base. Worldwarnow.substack.com also works. Be sure to follow the World War Now X account at worldwarnow_. Follow me at GnomeRad on X. Follow Dimitri at WWN host. Be sure to follow the Telegram account at World War Now Telly. Subscribe to the World War Now YouTube channel. I've got some live streams that are going to be coming up there very soon. Not going to make any promises, but potentially this week and next week I will be going live with a new weekly live stream. I'm probably going to be calling it World War Live or something like that. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Subscribe to that channel. Check us out on Rumble, World War Now. And if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, be sure to add us to your queue. Give us 5 stars. Share us there to anybody that perhaps isn't as active on YouTube or Substack. We are available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So thank you so much for listening. Again, get behind that paywall to support the show. Thank you to our paid subs. Thank you to everybody that has made it here to the end of the episode. Continue to pray for the persecuted church in Ukraine and Syria, in Palestine. Pray for Orthodox unity around the world. And please pray for us, your humble hosts here at World War Now, Conrad and Dimitri. With all of that, thank you so much for listening, and God bless. We will see you on the next one.